Today's episode is sponsored by June's Journey. Find your first clue by downloading June's Journey today. Available on Android and iOS mobile devices, as well as on PC through Facebook Games. Several years ago, a friend and I went on a multi-day hiking trip during winter. While preparing for the trip, I found a forum dedicated to the trail that we'd be hiking and several threads about people going missing on it. Most of the members blamed the hikers themselves, saying they were most likely inexperienced would-be adventurers who had went off trail and gotten lost. There was one old man on the forum who claimed that he completed the trail once a year for the past 50 or so years, and he believed that there was something more sinister behind these disappearances. Naturally, the other members laughed at him. We set off before sunrise to get as many miles in as possible on the first day. That entire day, we only met one other person, a friendly middle-aged man who lived somewhat locally. He seemed impressed, though, that we were taking on the trail in winter, and even invited us to camp near his property, but we declined and pressed on. But that night, we were surprised by some pretty dangerous terrain around the edge of a lake and took the decision to sleep in our bivy sacks under an overhanging rock. Not exactly ideal camping conditions, but given the potential hazards, we felt that this was the smartest choice. Now, I don't sleep well at the best of times in a bivy sack, and if you've ever been zipped into one, you'll know how claustrophobic it can feel. The rock hanging over my head didn't help either. But a few hours after, I did eventually manage to fall asleep. But I woke suddenly to the sound of my friend shouting and swearing at me. I popped my head out of my bivvy and saw that he was still sipped inside of his and had somehow gotten off the relatively level ground that we had been sleeping on and was slowly sliding down towards the lake. I quickly got up and dragged him, with great effort, back up to the level ground. He was absolutely furious with me, claiming that he'd felt me drag him, but soon calmed down and accepted that he'd most likely roll over repeatedly in his sleep. We didn't go back to sleep that night, and instead had some coffee and breakfast while waiting for the sun to come up. When we did set off, it started to rain heavily and didn't stop for almost the whole day. I was also having some trouble with an old injury in my leg, which slowed us down considerably. The sun seemed to disappear rather suddenly near the top of a deceptively steep hill as well, so we set up camp there, and then, this time, in a tent. After the rough couple of days, we were grateful to be inside of a tent, and the ground underneath us was actually not too bad as well. We talked and joked about the trip so far, and for some reason I remember my friend expressing his disappointment that he'd forgotten to pack his iPad, and then we tried to sleep. Soon after, though, I began to hear what sounded like human footsteps. I thought to myself, surely there isn't anybody else out here climbing this hill at night. The sound continued, and the more intently I listened, the more I became certain of what I was hearing. I poked my head out of the tent, and the sound suddenly stopped. I got out to pee, and I looked around, but there wasn't a soul in sight. Shortly after getting back into my sleeping bag, the footsteps started again, but this time they started circling our tent. By this point, I must admit that I was pretty frightened, and I asked my friend, "Are you hearing this?" And he responded, "Yes, I am," knowing that he'd been hearing them the entire time, and sounded as freaked out as I did. It genuinely terrified me. We got out of the tent again, and asked if anybody was there, but again, there was no one around, and the sound had stopped instantly. The footsteps around the tent continued for quite some time, and we didn't sleep. As soon as the sun came up, we packed up our things, got off the trail, and hiked to the nearest village, got a cab to the nearest town, and we made our way home. We've never been able to find a convincing explanation of what could have been causing the sound of the footsteps that night, and my friend has since become a full-fledged missing person, paranormal, and conspiracy enthusiast. So let me start by saying that my brother and I are extremely experienced desert campers, and we have lived near deserts pretty much our whole lives. I have never in my 20 years of life, ever for 1 second, believed in anything paranormal or anything to do with evil spirits. Unlike my brother, who has always sensed presences and been able to see mostly what we call jinn, also known as demons. That is, until last night, which is safe to say marks the last time that we will be camping alone in the desert. We always have the same place that we like to go when we want to camp with minimum effort, and our day started as normal. But as we got closer and closer to our destination, I saw my brother's mood completely shift. And when I asked what was wrong, he just sort of shrugged me off and told me to just keep driving. When we arrived, I felt completely fine, but my brother was still unusually quiet. It was around 1 p.m. at that point, and we were planning on leaving at around 12 or 1 a.m. Because of the heat, we made the terrible decision, though, to set up under a few trees and a source of water, which in Middle Eastern culture is where the jinns live at night. Not that I believed that at the time, of course. However, we still set up our camp and we continued on as normal. Now, my brother always says that when he feels a presence, or several in this case, he gets extremely unlucky. First, he almost dropped a box of coals on his foot. Then he spilled an entire bottle of Coke on his phone. Then he dropped it into the sand, then proceeded to smash his elbow on the edge of a chair that he was sitting on, which is now very swollen. And last but certainly not least, when he was looking through one of our boxes, he felt something cold and sharp press against his arm, and he realized that it was an unsheathed knife, which he packed with its case the previous night before, and he later said that it felt like something pushed his hand into it, right where his veins are. All of these events consecutively, within a matter of a few hours, was certainly making us both uneasy, and I, for the life of me, couldn't figure out why he was suddenly so unlucky. But as I was starting to question his clumsiness, a random couple appeared out of nowhere, informing us that they were stuck in the sand and needed some help. We drive a Land Cruiser and they had a Nissan Altima, so we didn't expect to encounter as many issues as we did, but we first dug them out without any issues. But as we pushed them out of the sand, they got stuck again. If you know anything about dune bashing or desert camping, then you understand the physics behind how wheels get stuck in the sand, and the way that this Nissan was stuck was incredibly unusual. It was literally stuck somewhere with plenty of space available for grip. And later on my brother said that as we were digging them out of the sand, that's when he really started feeling like an evil presence around us, but didn't want to say anything as not to ruin the trip and freak me out, all these people. So we ended up having to tow them out of the sand, which again was far harder than it had to be. First, our tow strap broke off from the bumper. The tow strap cost $200 and was fine, but their bumper was slightly damaged. Then we almost got stuck ourselves, and a 20-minute job took more like 90, which again was extremely unusual and, with hindsight, just the beginning of everything that was to come. So when we got back to our camp, we noticed how everything around us had suddenly got really unusually quiet. The area that we were in has hundreds of birds around, and as far as we have seen, 3 cats who sometimes pay us a visit. But there wasn't a single noise at all, other than our fire, that is, which was dying out really quickly. It had gotten pretty dark quickly, so we had scrambled to build a fire to cook our dinner before we were asked to help the couple, and I noticed the silence, but it didn't bother me. However, my brother suddenly grabbed my hand as we were sitting down to eat, and said with clear fear in his voice that we should go as quickly as possible and that he didn't feel safe. To ease both of our minds, we prayed. We're Christians, so of course we thought that it would help us. But I think it may have actually accelerated everything that happened that night, and just made whatever was out there with us very angry. So we quickly finished our dinner, and me being the skeptic, I was completely fine, and pretty much humoring my brother, until I started getting this really nagging feeling that it was time to pack up and leave. It hit me like a wave too, and I was quite taken aback by the feeling, so I voiced it to my brother, and he agreed that we should pack up right away and that we should leave. So we started packing up at a normal pace, like we were just tired and wanted to leave. And that's when we heard a sound very close to us, on the opposite side of the pond, which wasn't that big, that I could only describe as the sound of, I don't know, like death itself. And it seemed to go on for several minutes, and when I say that we looked at each other in absolute fear, I genuinely mean that I was about to have a heart attack, I think, right there and then. At that point, after being frozen for a few minutes, and quite reasonably so, after hearing that bellowing screech so close to us, we turned on the car, drove it back so that we could see better with the headlamps, and just started throwing everything into the car, without much care, but with a whole lot of urgency. And it was like after the screaming, that's when everything hit the fan. First, it was the sound of twigs snapping and footsteps all around us. Then it was the shadows behind the trees, and I tried everything to try and get those shadows to change shape, walking around the trees and moving the lights, but nothing. It looked like they were people just staring at us the whole time. And you could sort of feel it too. We really felt like we weren't alone and that whatever was out there wasn't friendly. We also noticed all three cats were huddled right behind our car, away from the trees, so they were not the ones snapping the twigs, but literally did not care if they were not going to move, as I was still getting out of there. Thankfully, they left when we started reversing, but they too looked absolutely terrified, and were just staring at the trees too. It also felt like whatever was there was getting closer as well, and I have never felt anything like that. It's hard to explain, but it was sort of like, I don't know, like a gut feeling, and you just know it's one of those natural instincts that you should not ignore. Thankfully, we were able to pack up quickly. Our tent was very close to the trees though, so that was nerve-wracking. And whilst we were packing, it was still very eerily silent. It's very normal for birds around that area to continue making sounds until like 2 or 3 in the morning. And at this point, it was about 8 p.m, so it was highly unusual. In any case, I personally think that it was the most terrifying thing as I was driving away back onto the main dirt path to leave the desert. I know cars very well, I know how they drive in the sand, and I know our car especially well because we've had it for so long. And I could instantly tell that the steering was off and completely fighting against me, which eventually fixed itself the second that we were on the highway. The sound of twigs snapping was still all around us, and it was loud enough to be heard over the sounds of the car even, and on the path was what seemed to be like every bird that was in the area, just standing there and staring at us until we got close enough to force them to walk away, not even fly. At one point, my brother just grabbed my shoulder and told me very sternly to just keep looking in front of me and under no circumstances to look through his window. It was his tone of voice that told me that I needed to listen to him. We were in a part of the desert where we had to pretty much drive through the whole of the accessible areas to get onto the highway, and there wasn't a single person around us. The only thing that we saw was a very clearly abandoned Toyota Hilux positioned behind a small dune and hidden behind the trees, but was far enough from our campsite to easily be ruled out as the source of the original screech. But the worst thing that I saw was when we were closing in on the exit. Now, we know these deserts very well. We've both grown up here and have been riding dirt bikes and quad bikes in these deserts since we moved here, and we know what wildlife to expect. Cats, birds, spiders, goats, even camels, mice, foxes sometimes, maybe even the occasional scorpion, or, if you're really unlucky, a snake. But that is pretty much it. There's really not much else in these deserts, and we saw standing in the middle of the path, staring directly at us, a deer of all things. A deer. I've only ever seen one deer in 16 years of living here, and that was in someone's garden as a pet. It's safe to say, though, that I was in complete shock, and the deer was not moving as well, until I got so close that we could practically smell that thing. before it just slowly walked off the path whilst looking right at us. We quickly moved past the deer, and again my brother, with a gasp and then very sternly, said to keep my eyes right on the road. I asked him as we got on the highway what it was that he kept seeing, and he very reluctantly told me that he kept seeing large figures around us any time that we went through a bend, and that they were all either pointing right at us or ahead of us. To be honest too, I'm pretty glad that he didn't tell me at the time, because I don't know how I would have reacted while I was driving. And well, we still were yet to encounter anyone, but we could still very clearly hear sounds all around us. And again, not the usual bird or cat, but very clearly big and unrelenting as well. When I saw the exit though, I was as happy as I'd ever been. But that quickly faded when, once again, we saw another deer standing right in the middle of the road, slowly walking away and looking right at us. Except this time, it didn't really look like a deer. I don't know what it was, to be honest, but it sort of looked more like a kangaroo mixed with a deer, and its eyes were really milky, and it sort of looked, I don't know, like rotten and really horrible. To be honest, I really didn't care much at this point. I just stepped on the gas, and fortunately, it had gotten out of the way just in time. Now, when you exit the desert here, you can either turn right onto a long stretch of highway, or you can go left and go through a small town, and take the back streets to a parallel highway. And as I was about to turn right, my brother, once again, with that same tone of voice, said go to the town and go to the right. Later, he once again said that he saw a line of fingers pointing ahead of us, so if we would have gone that way, we wouldn't have made it home in one piece. Thankfully, as we made it further and further away and closer to our home, the gut feeling of being watched was going away, and of course, having never experienced something like this before, I was distraught and I wanted to talk about it. My brother told me as we were going home that because we were alone, the jinn wanted to mess with us, that they wanted to scare us and most likely cause us harm, and that the way they get to you in such rural places is to force you to stop and then do whatever they want, which makes sense as to why there were so many animals on our path. He also said that they caused bad luck and he could feel them the second that we entered the desert that day, which explains his clumsiness all day as well, and that the car got stuck in such an unusual manner. This is also my younger brother by 3 years, and naturally, any time he would have ever told me about this sort of thing, I always just dismissed it as him just scaring himself or a delusion or whatever, but I can excuse the sounds that we heard, even the shadows that we saw last night. I can excuse the gut feeling as just being scared, but I cannot excuse those 2 deer that we saw staring right at us, and I cannot excuse the car just randomly fighting against me as I was driving like that. The deer, though, completely freaked me out, as did the tone of my brother's voice. And it's safe to say that we are not going camping there ever again. It's also safe to say that I won't ever be dismissing my brother when it comes to things like this ever again. I'm really thankful that we made it home safely that day. So some folks don't stop searching until they find the truth. And if you've got the eye of a detective, then June's Journey is the game for you. Play as the intrepid June Parker and follow her story to solve the death of her sister. You'll hunt for clues in hundreds of beautifully illustrated scenes to uncover new clues in this thrilling murder mystery set in the Roaring Twenties. I've actually really enjoyed playing this game in my spare time. It sort of reminds me of those old school Finder books if you've ever used one, where you have to look for a bunch of different things or people. But the really interesting thing about this particular game is that you're doing this in the midst of a murder mystery, so you have to find clues that assist with solving a crime. I also really like some of the unique features, like the ability to own your own island estate with expensive gardens and beautiful buildings. But I especially love the contest for short stories, which allows you to win prizes. I know some of you listeners are rather gifted writers, so for you guys, it's definitely worth checking out for sure. All in all, it's a really fun game that has kept me coming back for more during my downtime on my phone when I'm between tasks and chores and have a spare minute or two. I started a little bit ago now, and so I'm up to Chapter 4, and at the moment I'm continuing with Claire and Harry Van Buren's homicide. The game is also free to download, and in my opinion, is a great way to unwind if you enjoy puzzles like I do. So, find your first clue by downloading June's Journey today. Available on Android and iOS mobile devices, as well as on PC through Facebook Games. When I was around 9 years old, my friend and me were playing outside of our school. There was an event going on and it already got dark outside. We ran around, and to understand what happened next, you need to understand the layout of the schoolyard. So it was a big square with high bushes opposite of the school walls. It was just a straight line where kids would run and hide. There was space for about 2 people maybe standing next to each other between the bushes and a fence to a pavement. Every 10 meters or so, there was an opening into this space between bush and fence. So my friend and me, we're running around and then disappear into the bushes laughing. We walked behind the bushes. Like I said, only a straight line was possible behind the bushes. It kind of stopped and looked straight ahead. There was a bus stop, the one that I used for like 8 years when I became 10. It was about maybe 15-20 meters away from us. And there was a woman standing there. She was looking straight ahead, but we only saw her right side profile. She had a white dress on, and that was when I noticed that I couldn't see any feet. She was hovering there. I didn't see any features, in fact. She was more like a smudge. That's what I thought it was at first, too, just my eyes playing tricks on me. Until I looked at my friend staring also at her. We both kind of looked at each other confused. And then, scaring the life out of me, this smudge turned her head around, looked at us, and came closer at an alarming speed. We both screamed and ran outside the bushes to the middle of the yard, trying to catch our breath. I asked her what she saw, thinking that maybe I just startled her and caused her to scream because I screamed. But to my horror, she described the exact same thing that I saw. Us being stupid 9-year-olds, we started laughing, I think, and me being always the one stirring things up, I suggested to go back and check out if she was still there. My laughing stopped when I went behind the bushes and spotted her standing there again, at that bus stop. And yet again, she slowly looked at us and started to come closer. This time we screamed and ran back inside the school. I remember not telling anyone anything because I knew that they wouldn't believe me. I've only told this story to a handful of people. I also lost contact with this friend, but I wish that I could talk to her again and ask her if she remembers this day as clearly as I do. So allow me to briefly explain the main characters of the story so as not to confuse you. The story involves me and my dad, and 2 interactions involving attempted abuse by my dad's older sister's stepson. One story takes place at his aunt's home, and the second one, and worse of the 2 stories, takes place at my dad's younger sister's home during a family gathering. So, my dad's older sister will be Aunt A, my dad's younger sister will be Aunt B. Aunt A's stepson is a 24-year-old step-cousin. At the time of encounter number 1, I was in kindergarten. At the time of encounter number 2, I was in 1st grade. So to be clear, although I was very young when these 2 encounters happened, I still have very vivid memories of them both. However, that being said, I do have a better recollection of the second encounter as a 1st grader better than the first. Now, at the time of the first encounter, I had only ever met this older step-cousin once, maybe twice prior. I don't remember specifically why my dad and I had been at my aunt's house, and I also don't remember exactly how this situation came about, but if I am remembering it correctly, I believe my dad had gone to the restroom and I went off, wandering around the large home looking for him. This went unnoticed by the rest of the adults in the house because they were drinking, something that my dad was never into. And all I remember next is that The older step-cousin had been tickling me and wouldn't stop. Now, when I say I was being tickled, that's all that I really recall. Perhaps it was more than that, and my limited understanding of such had me remember that it was tickling, or perhaps it was just that, tickling. Either way, I really don't think any of us would disagree that an adult man should be alone with a little girl tickling her and touching her like that. But I remember suddenly, my dad came flying in the room. I remember my dad said very loudly to the step-cousin, "What are you doing?" My step-cousin jolted, and then something along the lines of, "Uncle so-and-so, you're overreacting, I was just..." My dad cut him off and stated very coldly, "I'm not your uncle, I don't know you. Get up and put your coat and shoes on, because we're leaving." By this time, his dad, or step-uncle, Aunt A, and other relatives had begun gathering around the door where my dad had been standing. I can't really remember if I was alone in a room with him, like a bedroom or what, but I was on some sort of surface higher up that he was tickling me on. Looking back now, I can clearly see the look on my dad's face while all of his family was trying to convince him to calm down and stay. It's obvious to me that he was doing everything in his power not to blow up and traumatize me. He just kept looking at them with his lips pressed and shaking his head, saying, "I don't want to hear it." I briefly remember my dad asking me questions about the step-cousin in the car on the way home. I also remember him explaining to me that I should not be alone with any adult, especially a male adult, no matter if they're family or not, but also making sure that I knew that I didn't do anything wrong, nor was what just happened in any way my fault. My dad did not talk to his family for a year or so after that, give or take. I was too young to know or understand why, just that they had a falling out. So, now to the next encounter. My dad had slowly started to speak with family again. It was summer and Aunt B's oldest child had just graduated from high school. Thus, my dad and I had been invited to the graduation party. Initially, my dad was not going to go when he found out that my step-cousin would be there, but his dad had called my dad and had an hour or two for conversations on the phone about my dad being mistaken by his interpretation of what had happened. I don't think that my dad believed him, but surely he felt that we would be at a big family event and this step-cousin would have to be literally out of his damn mind to try something in the same house as my dad for a second time. But for the first 2 or 3 hours at the graduation party, my dad kept me glued to his hip. There was a group of about maybe 13 other kids of varying ages, all running through Aunt B's house, backyard, front yard, and basement, and I remember staring longingly at them. My dad noticed, and so did a couple of other family members. I don't really remember who though, but I do remember my step-uncle and then my dad's older brother kind of busting him up about being overprotective and not letting me play with the other kids and all that. My dad tried to stick up for himself when one of them turned to look at me and said, "Baby girl, do you want to go and play with the other kids?" Of course I said yes, and then looked to my dad for approval. Now that I'm older and that I'm a parent myself, I understand the kind of face that my dad was making. He had a look of contemplation. He surely felt uneasy and wanted to protect me and keep me by his side, but I could also see the dilemma that he was having in my mind now that I voiced my desire to do so. Some lady interjects and says something along the lines of, "Oh my gosh, you're not going to be able to keep her locked up forever, you know. Let the girl play. Look how many of us are here. What's going to happen?" So finally, I was given the okay by my dad, who showed me where he would be and how much time I had to play freely. For the first 20 minutes or so, we were all running in a group all through the different doors of the house. I think this made my dad feel better because he could see me every few minutes too. Finally though, some of the older kids suggested that we go down to the basement to see what Aunt B had done to it. It was unfinished the last time that I had seen it beforehand, and apparently it now had carpet, the walls are painted, there was a game room, and then a living room that shaped into a sort of private wing to the right-hand side of the other end of the stairs where the bedroom was. There was no wall or door separating the bedroom from the living room section. However, it still provided some privacy. Once we saw the new setup, we all began going back upstairs, me being the last in the line. As we were walking up the stairs though, I see my 24-year-old step-cousin, who was now walking down the stairs. He grabbed me by my shoulder and said, "Oh hey, I hope you're not leaving. I was just coming down to show you something really cool that RB put down here." His voice had a high and exciting pitch. It was a tone of voice that I would find highly unsettling today should I hear a man talk this way to a kid that he hardly knew. By the time that he had finished making that comment to me about the cool thing that he wanted to show me, all the other kids were already gone. I remember looking up towards the top of the stairs and then back at him, and he grabbed me by my hand to lead me down. "Come on, you'll love it." I recall feeling very put off by this, but also feeling too small and too little to say or do otherwise. I also think that a part of me may have felt kind of cool that someone so much older wanted to show me something, a little kid after all. This is the first time that I can remember being allowed to go off on my own for any length of time, and so I was on that high of independence, I guess. He immediately walks me down past the couch and the TV setup, and towards the bedroom part of the basement. I remember him using his hand to pat on the bed while teasing, "So, do you want to try it out? See how good of a bed it is? Go on." I climbed on the bed and immediately started jumping and bouncing as high as I could. Looking back, I remember his face getting frustrated because I was not doing what he was expecting me to do. He tried sitting on the bed and he tried laying down, but I wouldn't stop jumping, and once he laid, I got down. He kept picking me up though with his hands under my armpits and placing me back on the bed, and saying that he wanted to lay with me and take a nap, which I responded by saying that no, I don't take naps with boys. He then starts asking me questions about my dad. "Do you ever sleep in bed with your daddy?" "Only if I ever had a bad dream," I replied. "What kind of things do you and your dad do, or where do you guys lay together, because I know how close you and him are?" "Oh yes, I love my daddy. Daddy and I like to lay on the couch together and watch movies." This statement from me clearly went off like a light bulb in his head, because that's when he leads me from the bed back towards the couch in the living room section. He then lays down on his side, prompting me to lay down with him and pull me closer to him. He would lay me down on my side in front of him and tried to unbuckle my jeans when I would jump up. He had at some point unfastened his own jeans and unzipped his zipper. I was too young to understand what was going on, but I knew something was wrong, and I remember saying something about my daddy not being happy about this to him. He was in the middle of trying to tell me that he had asked my dad if he could do this with me, and my dad said that it was okay, when suddenly I hear my dad yelling and stomping down the stairs, and man, was he absolutely furious. "None of you know where she is," he was saying. "Last time any of you kids saw her was in the basement with that guy." I jumped off the couch one more time as my dad was making an appearance in the stairway. He took one look at me and one look at this 24-year-old man who had been alone with me for who knows how long, and just said calmly, "You," and expletives, before charging at him, punching him in the face, dragging him back up from the floor by his neck. My dad had one arm around his throat while he used the other to point in his face while screaming at him. He was screaming, I knew it, over and over again. He was also screaming, "That's my daughter," over and over again. When suddenly, my dad had his two older brothers and my step-cousin's dad on his back, pulling him off of this guy. I remember that they ended up ripping my dad's shirt off of him because my dad just wouldn't let go, and he wouldn't stop screaming that he was going to kill him. Finally, he looked around the room and said, "I'm done with you, all of you. How dare you?" And he then said, "Let's go, baby," before scooping me up and taking me to my car seat. We drove off and we quickly stopped at the gas station. I remember my dad wiping something from his eyes. I remember him apologizing to me for letting me go off on my own and asking me if he scared me. Although Aunt A stayed with his creepy father and remains married to him today, the step-cousin was never invited to another family function again. My dad and I did not see or speak to that side of my family for 6 years, and it was never the same again. Remember, guys, it's not always strangers you have to look out for. It's actually the people that are closest to you that are sometimes the most dangerous. This was a few years ago in my old house, around Halloween. One day, I, a 43-year-old male, was home alone in my house. I have a wife, 3 kids and a dog. I'm in my basement cutting wood and working, when all of a sudden I hear thumping on the ceiling above me, first level floor. It's rhythmic and almost perfectly in beat. I'm a handyman and do a lot of my own fixing and know the usual sound houses make. This was not usual. I start to follow the thumping around the first floor. It's as if someone or something is walking around. I call out my wife's name. No answer. My kids. No answer. Just soft moaning that is getting louder with the thumps. My dog is with me in the basement and following the sound with me, with his tail straight up, completely silent. This was weird too because I have a very loud and sort of jumpy dog. I then slowly follow the thumping to the steps, and I hear a weak old woman's voice calling for Jimmy, not my name, but my name does start with a J, over and over. Ignoring my hellos, she keeps walking around my first floor, calling out, moaning and thumping. I grab my dog by the collar and leave out the basement door and walk around the outside of my house. It's worth noting too that I've had a lot of weird supernatural things happen in my life, especially around Halloween for some weird reason, but I could feel that this was different, very different. I go up the street and there's a younger couple calling out for someone. Let's say Nancy for the sake of this. I go up to them and say, "Are you Jimmy?" The young guy looks at me with simultaneous relief and confusion across his face. He tells me that that's his dad's name, but he passed years ago. Turns out, Nancy was his mum with some kind of mental issue. She snuck out of her house up the road. Her family lived in my house before we did. Didn't know that. And she was having some kind of an episode. Went looking for her husband in her home. Oh, and also, she had a wooden leg. I don't know the story, but that was the thumping. We got her home safely, and I also double-checked my doors from that point on, but I'm actually really glad that I didn't go up there, because who knows how she might have reacted with me, a stranger, allegedly being in her house. So I genuinely have no clue why I haven't said anything about this yet, considering so much weird stuff happens in my life. But this was probably one of the creepiest encounters that I've ever had, and I feel lucky that I walked away. So one summer night a few years ago, I was out for a drive with a friend. We decided to make a little late-night stop at a nearby waterfall for a little bit of a smoke sesh, since it was always super dead and really peaceful in the evenings. This specific time, I didn't make it anywhere near the waterfall, but as we were getting out of the car, I, a 19-year-old female at the time, really had to pee. Now, I used to go to this waterfall very often, and I know that area like the back of my hand, even in the dark. So I went and found a spot where it was too dark for me to see more than maybe 2 feet in front of me. I tried to stay as close to the forest exit as possible without being seen by a semi-busy road. The entire time I was up there, I absolutely know that I was being watched, very closely. I ended up getting out of there as fast as I possibly could, jumping in the car and locking the doors. That entire time, I could feel someone's eyes digging into me like daggers, though. I was genuinely ready to be grabbed. What confirmed I was definitely being watched happened when I got back to the car and I saw a kid run across the street directly up to where I was. He came from nowhere too, a literal cliff on one side and hence the waterfall, and I could genuinely only describe him as the little boy from the Jungle Book, clothing and all. I get majorly weird vibes every time that I go there now that I've never ever got before. It still has a weird feeling in the day, and I genuinely don't know how this happened so quickly. A kid would have had to have scaled a large cliff and moved at a super high speed. I'm going with the most logical explanation in my city, which is people living in the woods with possible ulterior motives. But at this point, I'm not ruling anything out. This was by far the weirdest and creepiest encounter that I've had in a long time, that I recall, and it has honestly just kind of stuck with me. I hate going to this waterfall now, which absolutely sucks because it's so close to my house and it's really gorgeous. But I don't know, I just get the weirdest vibes when I go there now. Also, just before anything else is said, I know how stupid this was, but I was 19 and I'm stubborn as all, and so nothing would have talked me out of peeing in a place where I need a flashlight. Safe to say, though, that I have not been back to that part of the park since. It has taken me many years to tell this story out of both fear and embarrassment, but I share this today as more than simple therapy for myself, but also as a warning to all people. Be careful who you might meet on social media. So in 2018, my ex-husband and I were at the end of a very tumultuous marriage. He and I had been polyamorous for about 3 years before I met this guy. His name was Jez. I met Jez on OkCupid. I was 28 and he was 42. We hit it off very quickly. After a few weeks of talking, I agreed to meet up with him at a restaurant close to my house. We sat and talked for a few hours before I invited him over to meet my husband. Things went very well too, and they seemed to get along, so Jez and I started dating. This guy too completely swept me off my feet. Jez was sweet and caring. He enthusiastically listened to every little thing on my mind, engaged and validated me. Over and over again, he absolutely revered me for my strength and wisdom. He practically worshipped me for all that I was and all that I was becoming. He showered me with gifts, flowers, and random good deeds just to make me feel safe, wanted, and cared for. I had never been in a relationship that felt quite like that. It was wonderful. It was as though we had been looking for each other for years. After the first few weeks, we had a meltdown over my polyamorous nature. He pulled the plug because he said that he was already falling for me and couldn't handle sharing me. I stood my ground and accepted this boundary and the fact that I would have to let him go. I left that night sad but confident that I had done the right thing for the both of us. That next week he sent me flowers and a card to my workplace, begging for another chance and reassuring me that he would rather try than not and end up regretting it. And even though it was scary, he wanted to take his journey with me. So we continued dating and it was really wonderful. Long nights we spent awake talking, sharing, laughing, lovemaking and planning. We went places and did things that I'd always wanted to do. Then in the deepest, most intimate moments, when we would just sit in silence, he would grip my hand to his face in solidarity and astonishment, asking where I've been all this time. Our time together was effortless. We fit together like puzzle pieces. By August of 2018, my marriage had ended, by no fault of Jez's, and by October my husband had moved out. I was on a lease at the time and knew that I couldn't afford the place on my own, so finding a roommate was essential. I had no support system to fall back on, nor did anyone else that I know need a place at the time, so Jez offered to move in. Even then I was hesitant. I mean, we'd only been together about 4 months, and I knew everything always changes when you move in with a partner. But despite my hesitation, I agreed. I mean, he was wonderful to me, so how bad could it be? But boy, I was not prepared for the change that was to come. It was literally like night and day. Jez suddenly became a different person. He was extremely controlling, jealous, and lazy. Nothing like the person that I thought I'd met. And the way that he treated me progressively got worse and worse. Hanging out with friends became a burden, if not impossible, because he would blow up my phone, guilting me about leaving him alone or not involving him in some way. Yet when I tried to, it was also treated as a burden and inconvenience, as he would huff and puff his way through even the concept of leaving space for anyone but ourselves. In December of 2018, we attended my work Christmas party. I'd given him the option whether he wanted to go or not. It was really neither here nor there for me, especially because I had already learned that he really didn't do well if he felt pressured into social situations. But I opened the invitation to him because he had expressed to me over and over that it was important for him that he was involved in my social life. For the full month, he knew about it. He insisted that he wasn't going. I took it as him being introverted and didn't push the issue. I let him know that I would make sure that he felt welcomed if he decided to go, but not to feel obligated. So I was surprised when he changed his mind at the last minute and insisted on going, and even more stunned when we went and he actively acted as though he didn't want to be there. Everyone there was incredibly welcoming and included him in the festivities and conversation. However, he still practically grumbled the entire night about the whole thing, mumbling insults and critiquing every little part of the party under his breath, as though being there was absolutely awful to have to endure. No one really seemed to notice the low whispering insults and gripes. At one point, after a couple of glasses of wine, my direct manager leaned into Jez and started praising him. She and I were very close, therefore she was intimately familiar with what I had gone through with my ex-husband. "I'm so happy she's with you," she bleated through wine happy. "You have been absolutely transformative for her. It's so nice to see her finally happy and appreciated." Without missing a beat, Jez grimaced at the comment and quickly snapped back, "You don't know me." I honestly didn't believe my ears. It was one of those moments where time sort of stops and you just know that you couldn't have heard that correctly. I sat, brewing on it for a minute, before another light-hearted interaction with Jez prompted him to suddenly snap at me through gritted teeth, "Stop it." This triggered me, and I lost it. I pulled him outside and asked him what the problem was. I called out his behavior and told him that if he was going to act that way, then he could just leave. That if he didn't want to be there, he should have stayed home. He ended up sort of giving a half apology, and we went back inside and finished the party. I remember the drive home that night, staring out of the dark window at nothing in particular, in worried silence. I might have messed up, was my only thought through the entire drive. This all started out slow, of course, like waving me away or invalidating my experiences and ideas due to my age, that I was just dramatizing my experiences because I was young, etc. The man who 6 months prior had validated me, my trauma and experiences to the ends of the earth, now every time I started a story or tried to share anything, even trying to plan out meals for the week, he would openly show annoyance as though I was violating his time and attention. Before I knew it, he was snapping at me over every little thing. If I asked how his day was or talked about my day, he would aggressively shut it down. "Why do you always ask me that? I don't want to talk shop at home. I really don't care about your work. It's work." Before I knew it, I couldn't even bring him a plate of breakfast without being snapped at. It was almost as though he was sort of, like testing me. When Jez and I first started dating, he flat out refused to talk about most of all of his exes. He refused to name them or discuss any of the issues or lessons learned. They didn't matter, he claimed. They weren't in his life for a reason. It was the same reasoning he also used in reference to my more recent exes, talking about them, including my own ex-husband, may as well have become off limits. Anytime I brought up either of our exes, he would become incredibly agitated, belittling, and just overall very aggressive. I took this as both an age gap issue, as I have a tendency to dwell, as well as insecurity and a threat to the life that we were trying to build. However, after he moved in and this hot-button topic had been established several times, he would bring up his exes and how they looked, telling me on more than one occasion that he would have never dated me back in the day, and that I was lucky he lowered his standards. I didn't even really know what to say to this, to be honest. I would laugh it off and shove it in my back pocket. Noted, I guess. He then started bringing up my looks and accusing me of catfishing him. I had stopped taking care of myself due to the isolation and had also put on some weight, so most of the clothes that I had once felt great in no longer fit. And since Jez had also been dishonest with me about his financial position, he was always needing extra money here and there, leaving me broke almost all of the time. A horrible tragedy happened that following summer while Jez and I were together. I received notice that a good friend I went to art school with actually deleted himself while tripping on LSD. Our whole class was devastated. He was, without contest, the best photographer of our class and one of the most kind-hearted individuals that I'd ever had the pleasure of knowing. Also, as someone who is familiar with LSD, I was rocked. Jez, however, was far from supportive. He pretty much immediately shrugged it off as, "That's life. I guess that's what you get when you mess around with LSD." I was baffled at such an unsympathetic response, and even more later when Jez started to interrogate me about my relationship with this guy, asking the last time it was that I had even talked to this friend. "You don't even know this guy anymore. Who cares?" I broke up with him the first time after he called me at work raging. I was busy, so I wasn't able to answer right away, but once I was finally able to answer, I was met with intense anger. It was storming, and one of my dogs was having an anxiety attack due to the storm and separation anxiety. This wasn't the first time, and he was well aware of what she needed in those moments. "But why aren't you answering my calls? You answer when I call you. I don't care where you are." He went on for a few minutes, calling me a terrible girlfriend, and laying into me over my sudden distance and lack of communication while I was at work. At this point, though, I was done, and I just lost it. I tore into him over everything, especially causing problems for me at work. That being in my life is a privilege, and that if he's going to wake up every day acting like he hates me, then I don't know what on earth he's even doing with me. I told him that I expected him to get his things and leave. He was always threatening to go back to his old roommates where there was still a room. I didn't want him there anymore when I got home, and we could coordinate times for him to come and get the rest. He flatly refused, suddenly victimizing himself, claiming that he had nowhere to go. "How dare you make me fall in love with you? How dare you take me to your father and then dump me?" My manager and her husband ended up following me home that evening because she was actually concerned for my safety and had offered to let me stay with her for a few days. I will never forget the scene that I walked into, though. It was like Theon Greyjoy begging for his life. My boss stood next to me, watching as this 42-year-old man crawled on his knees before me, begging for mercy and communication. At one point, wrapping his arms around my legs, crying into them. "I can't believe this is happening. She's the love of my life. You know that," he cried to my boss. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. This was the antithesis of the heartless person that I'd been spending my days with. I shook him off and went to the back of the house, gathering enough of my things to get me through the next few days, as well as any and all valuables that I could think of. It did take a few days, but after about a week, Jez started blowing up my phone, apology after apology. Suddenly, he was the man that I met again, full of humility and self-awareness. He acknowledged the awful way that he had treated me and sent me walls and walls of well-thought-out messages, psychoanalyzing his own behavior, where it comes from, and the ways that he knows it needs to be changed. And so, I took him back. Like a dumb and desperate girl, I took him back. It wasn't long into the second round, though, that he started to guilt me over the breakup. My panic had damaged his relationship with people in my life, and he made sure that I knew that it was my responsibility to fix it. It wasn't long after this that my car ended up breaking down at a gas station close to home. There was a very nice couple in the vehicle next to me that came to my rescue and checked things out under my hood. The gentleman turned out to be a mechanic for a living, so he had a pretty good theory about what could potentially be going on. By this time, I had already attempted to contact Jez to let him know what was going on and where I was. And it wasn't long until he got off work, and so he told me to sit tight and he would be there shortly. Meanwhile, this sweet couple stayed put and kept me company while I waited. Jez barreled in about maybe 15 minutes later, completely ignoring the couple that had helped me. Touching base, the gentleman handed me a slip of paper with a name and a phone number on it, reviewing what he thought was going on with my car, before Jez butted in, cutting him off, saying, "I said she's fine," he snapped. I could see the woman out of the corner of my eye slink away at this comment and get into the passenger seat of their car. I could feel the sudden tension, like maybe she's been there before. The gentleman didn't move and shifted his attention to me as Jez walked into the store. I could see that he was clearly concerned. You okay?" he asked in a low, almost whisper. "You don't have to answer that, but if you need anything..." He looked down at the number in my hand and nodded to it. Seriously. With that, he got into the driver's seat of his car and he drove away. I've thought about that couple countless times since that night, but everything went right back to the way that it was before, as though the initial breakup never even happened. The same eggshells, the same belittling. If anything, it was worse, in fact, because I had permanently damaged our relationship. If I had just not been so dramatic, if I didn't run away from everything, then maybe he wouldn't have to work so hard for respect in my life. One night, we got into an argument. I don't really even remember what it was about, but I had to be up early for work the next morning, so I paused the argument in order to get some sleep. When I went to lay down, I heard the TV on. I have a sound bar, so the volume can get pretty loud. Jez proceeded to turn the volume up and up and up, far past any volume that I ever pushed those same speakers to, even for parties. The very walls were reverberating with the sound of the TV at astronomical volumes. Jez then started laughing hysterically. It was a laughter manic with anger, as though something might be funny on TV, but he might also jump through a window right now. I remember laying in bed absolutely horrified at what was happening. I mean, I knew things had gotten bad, but this... Now, I was scared. I got out of bed and asked him to turn it down, to which he responded, scoffing, "I'll watch TV if I want to," and turned it up even louder. To be honest, it was at this point that it suddenly felt a bit like a horror movie. I started crying, begging him to please just let me sleep. And he started mocking me and calling me names for crying, like, "Poor baby is crying again. That's your card, isn't it? Crying." This caused the fight to start again, and he started screaming at me, followed me to my bedroom where he suddenly punched a door not 2 inches from my head. His eyes were suddenly black too, and he looked me in the eye, sending the clear, unsympathetic and hostile message that was a warning, and next time he would miss. My whole system had shut down at this point, and I sunk to the floor in a panic attack. My ex-husband had issues with violence. Jez knew that. All of our rentals prior to that one had holes in walls and doors peppered throughout our unit due to my ex-husband's inability to handle his emotions, but he never hit me or even came close to it. I crumbled to the ground, feeling powerless, trapped and afraid. As my thoughts continued to race, he continued to berate and mock my panicked state. Most of our argument from that night was a blur, to be honest, but ended abruptly once he threatened to put my social security number on the dark web. At this point, all that was left for me to do was fight, and I blacked out, went ballistic, screaming at him to get out. I felt rabid, dangerous, as I screamed like a banshee for him to leave my home. It was over, and I was ending it that second. I contacted my landlord and explained what had been going on. Jez would also end up contacting her, weaving his own tale that I was moving out and tried to have the lease transferred into his name. Luckily, since I was several steps ahead of him, My landlord didn't fall for it and contacted me immediately. She even personally came and changed my locks for me, gave me the personal contact of a police officer close by in case he showed up again, and took half off my rent for the next month. I am forever grateful to her for these simple acts of kindness that were above and beyond anything that I would ever expect from a landlord. It truly was a kind thing to do. But it took weeks for him to stop messaging me. The only reason why I didn't block him was out of fear that he would show up at my house. Although I had contacts for protection, I knew that I would rather get a daily apology video than have to deal with him at my doorstep. So they persisted. For a while, the same act from before, the love bombing, the promises, grasping at straws, trying to find the weak spot where I would let him back in, but this time I ignored it. It continued for weeks before he finally gave up. He bowed out gracefully, stating boldly that he will always love me. I left him on read. The illusion was destroyed at this point. It took me several years to pick up the pieces. If my divorce wasn't enough, then this definitely made me lose trust in myself. But to be honest, I still don't really understand what the endgame was. In fact, in one of our last discussions, I asked him desperately what happened to the guy that I fell in love with. Jez looked me dead in the eye, smirked really creepily, and said, "That guy doesn't exist. I told you what I had to tell you in order to get you away from your husband. You're just stupid," and fell for it. So I will start by saying that even though these experiences have happened to me, I've always been a skeptic. My mother, who passed away 9 years ago, was towards the end of her life a deep believer, as well as both of my sisters, though after my mother's passing, they have not spoken much on the subject unless asked about it, but they can verify 3 of the 4 stories that I'm about to lay out here as well. The first 3 of these stories take place in my childhood home, in a trailer park that always seemed to have an odd vibe around it in general. I never found anything weird out about it, but we always had this theory, like maybe an Indian burial ground or something was there, though I doubt it, but it was just a weird little rural area of southwest Michigan. The 4th story takes place at my father and stepmother's house, about 8 miles north of the house the first 3 stories take place in. But I'll start with what I feel is the least intense, moving to the ones that still spark great fear for me. So, story number 1. I'll start this story at my father and stepmother's house, as it's pretty simple. I lived there in my early 20s and had the classic downstairs basement room. I was the black sheep of sorts, so it was only fitting to put me there anyway. We had a dog that always stayed with me, especially when family was doing whatever. This happened multiple times, but I'll share the last time that I remember this happening. So, I'm sitting downstairs hanging out, YouTubing or whatever I was doing, when my dog, like he normally does when people come home, starts going absolutely nuts, barking and pacing for me to let him upstairs so that he can greet whoever he believes came through the door, and as I get out of my chair to let him do so, I hear the classic footsteps of what I believe is my little brother, as they're too fast to be my mother or stepmom. I hear them go all the way to the back end of the house and stay there, so I let the dog out. I follow suit, thinking maybe my folks need help grabbing something they may have brought home. I get upstairs. Nothing at all. The lights are off. Nobody's home. The dog even seems to be thinking, what the heck? Now, at this point, this is the 4th or 5th time that this has happened in the few years that I'd been living there, mostly starting in the latter part of those years. So this time, I felt ballsy about it. I decided like an idiot to just ask if anybody was there. There was no answer. So I go further into the house facing the hallway, leading to the back of the house to a couple of bedrooms. I put myself in a bathroom so that when I yell at it, I won't see down the hallway when it comes to kill me. But I get in the bathroom and, like an idiot, I somewhat angrily yelled, "Who is in my house?" And at this point, I hear something fall in the back bathroom between the two bedrooms. I poke my head out to verify that nobody is there. I check the garage, nobody's there either, and then went back downstairs where I waited for people to actually come home. It was a really eerie evening for me, and I don't know, the house just didn't feel right that day. So the second story, this is where to me these things started to amp up a bit and they really get a bit freaky. Just something about this trailer park and the trailer that I lived in. This was after living in the same trailer with my mum, who my dad then took over after their divorce, and was now living there with my stepmom. So I remember that this was maybe 2006, I think. I was probably 13 or so, and at the time loved being up late as it was summer vacation from school. And this summer, I liked smoking with my sister late at night in the backyard with the neighbor boy. And this night, we weren't smoking anything illicit, just us three hanging out smoking cigarettes and talking. For some reason or another, my sister takes her phone out and, I kid you not, for some reason starts recording an audio file. This, I think, was on one of those unbreakable Nokia phones back in the day, and the quality is really terrible on these things, but it was recording nonetheless. Not for anything paranormal, but thinking about it now, I don't remember for the life of me what she was trying to record. The point is that she was recording all three of us standing there, when all of a sudden, about 2 feet to my right, we all hear the most unsettling, blood-curdling, just nasty woman scream for a solid 2 seconds. Immediately being like, what the heck was that? Even getting so worked up that we called the police, who didn't find anything after showing up 20 minutes later. But the best part? My sister the next day realized that she had recorded this audio file. Naturally, she goes into her phone to review it, realizing that she had never thought to stop the recording, but there it was on her phone. So we listened back to it. Everything's normal, you can hear us talking right up until you then hear this scream, which when this happens in the recording, you hear us go sort of quiet, then a very sort of static type silence, and then you hear us all go, what was that? And then the recording cuts off a few seconds later. Back then too, I always said it must have been a fox, but with how loud it was and how close it was, there was no fox anywhere near us. So that explanation just didn't make much sense. I must admit that I have a bit of a hard time with these two stories, as they're the only two that have sort of like visual or auditory experiences, and to me are the absolute hardest to explain, which kind of leaves me feeling out of my wits even thinking about them, let alone about sharing them here, but anyway, I digress. So the third story, to start, my mum was always a bit of a night owl, no exception even when we lived with her until 2005, and I think that this was somewhere around 2002 or 2003. The bedroom that I was in was right next to where the kitchen was. You could in fact see right out but you couldn't really see the table where we sat from here as the angle cut off that view, but it would have been to the right of the bedroom door looking out. Now, I remember waking up at about 3 or 4 in the morning or so, and looking out and seeing the dining room light on, and hearing my mum using a sewing machine at the table. So I yelled for her to come in here. I hear the machine stop, and she comes to the doorway, and what I remember was just the most menacing, horrifying, mean look on her face as she just stood there, staring right at me. No words, no nothing. Just this look like, why are you talking to me right now? I don't really remember at this point if I said or did anything while she stood there doing this, but just as quick as she was standing there, she just as quickly, still with no words at all, turned first her head away, then her body followed suit, and then she just walked away. This, as most would assume, is very much unlike most anyone's mum, but I very much remember as soon as she was out of sight, I started screaming and crying, and yet again I hear her getting up from her sewing machine, this time a little more frantic. She comes in asking what's wrong, with the classic mum calming down, horrified kid going on. So I told her what I had literally just seen, and she said very plainly that she had not just been in here, and that she had been sewing the whole time. And it is not like my mum to just come in and stare at me down menacingly like that, especially at 3 a.m. to scare me. So, to be honest, I believed her. Now, the fourth story is my least favorite of these. I don't even really like thinking about this one, but it's the one that I wanted to bring here most, as I just want to know what other people may think about this. So again, much like the last story, it's 3 or 4 in the morning. I'm in the same exact bedroom, bottom bunk, sister is on the top bunk. This time everybody is asleep. All the lights in the house are off and it's pretty quiet. When suddenly I hear what I believe is a slightly heavy load in our dryer, or maybe the washer washing a little off balance or something. This sound wakes me all the way up because it just seems a bit weird. So I roll over to get comfy and I open my eyes a bit. As I'm looking around, I see what is some movement toward the kitchen. Now, again, you can see from this room out into the kitchen, but not the dining area. What you saw from my perspective is the island in the kitchen where the sink was, and you could see a little far sort of side off of our living room behind that. But I'm just kind of scanning the kitchen, listening to this weird sound that I keep hearing, and that was when I see it. I can't say that it was standing, as I saw no legs, but standing or stood behind the island, but extremely tall, is this very plain, almost 2D looking man. All white, no features whatsoever, no face, no nothing. As you look down his body, it appeared to be more faint too, but still a definite white figure or person just stood there. To be honest too, at first I'm thinking that it must be headlights hitting the window from a car outside or something, but then I realized that this thing has sort of like a cowboy type hat on. And not only that, it seems like it's taking its hat off and like tipping its hat in my direction. Like it's tipping its hat at me almost. Now, at this point, I'm genuinely trying to make sure that I'm 100% awake, and as far as I could tell, I was. So I go back to looking because naturally I just cannot look away now. And it just sort of repeats the same exact movements over and over again. Pulls the hat down, puts it back on, pulls it down, then back on. All the while, this weird sound is still happening. So I'm trying to justify it in my mind by thinking somehow the neighbor's kid is playing a prank on me and somehow is outside the window that's a bit behind this thing using some sort of a puppet or something. But then I realize how stupid a thought that this is. And that was the moment that I started screaming. My sister wakes up and asks what's going on. I tell her exactly what I see and I ask her if she sees it too. But oddly, no. She doesn't see it at all. This makes me scream even more though. This time waking up my mum, who as she comes into the kitchen turns on the light, and as soon as she did that, it just disappeared. Though I still hear the strange sound, so I ask my mum what the sound is and if the washer is going, and she goes and looks and neither machine is running. And for whatever reason, this woman takes one look at me, feels my head to see if I have a fever, which I didn't, and then tells me that I have a fever and that's why I'm seeing stuff like that. So I try and calm myself. She leaves the room and turns the kitchen light off again. And sure enough, there is this guy again, still tipping that hat over and over. Eventually, I just convinced myself, I guess, that I was having a fever illusion or something. I managed to roll over and I fell asleep somehow afterward. I still mention this story to my sister, and she still very vividly remembers every bit of it, the way that she saw it anyway. Years later too, and after some study on this subject, I have always said that it was the Hat Man, but the thing is that what I've read and heard on the Hat Man is nothing like this. My mother later also recounted this story and later told me that though she didn't see or hear what I did, she only told me that I had a fever and stuff to calm me down, and she knew that it wasn't a fever causing it. So, I guess the question is, what did I see that night? When I was a preteen, early teen, I had reoccurring nightmares involving my maternal grandparents. Their residence would change or be different in many of my dreams, but there would always be this dark room with an evil presence inside of it, usually on an upper floor. I would usually be too frightened to go inside, but the few times that I was brave enough to enter, there would only be darkness, that malevolent feeling, and sometimes there would be a mirror of all things. In one particular dream, my family on my mum's side was downstairs talking and enjoying themselves while I happened to be exploring in the evil room upstairs. I looked into the mirror and I saw the reflection of a girl running past me. When I ran downstairs to tell them what I had just saw, everyone and everything just became completely dead silent. They were all just sort of looking at me without saying a word, until my mum came up to me, placed her hand on my shoulder and said, "That girl represents the curse of my past." I rarely had any more of those dreams after that one. Now, some interesting, albeit creepy, real-life facts to consider. After my mum's parents died, my mum, aunts, and myself cleaned up their house, and I happened to find that exact same mirror underneath a bed in that room that, when I was a lot younger and my grandfather was still alive, he would always yell and call me out of it for some reason. I always felt some kind of, dark presence in parts of that house and their backyard shack as well. My grandfather was a Shriner Freemason, and according to my mum, he was very abusive towards her when she was young. She didn't really like to talk about it much, though. Also, when my mum and her two sisters were young, they messed around with a Ouija board once. Hopefully just once, although it only takes one time apparently. There's a lot of strange things involving myself and my family, and I just provide this to paint a bit of a picture. So, what I saw when I was younger was this. I saw pale-coloured, non-human creatures in my room once when I was really young. I remember, hallucinating is probably the best term for it, and crawling to the door. Then I heard my mother call for me from across the house, and I had enough willpower to go to get to her, and as soon as I exited my room, everything went pitch black for a couple of minutes. My vision was mostly gone, my awareness was screwed up, but both came back to me soon after feeling my way down the hallway into my mum's direction. I led her back to my room, but whoever or whatever was there was gone without a trace. Before she died in 2010, she told me that she remembered that occurrence, and for some reason, she was the one to use the word creatures, which always stuck out to me. Did she see something? I'm fairly certain that I'm not being told everything, and I just know deep down that whatever I saw was real. Two friends and I briefly witnessed a V-shaped UFO in Tulsa, Oklahoma as well one night, back in April of 2009. It was absolutely huge, seemingly cloaked, besides the dim lights, transparent or semi-transparent, slow-moving and completely silent. So far, the only unidentified craft I've seen, to my knowledge. On a related note, too, one of my paternal uncles was in the military. He actively researched UFOs for unknown reasons. He's very secretive about such things, and has at least 1 or 2 books about them, so my family seems to have a history with this, which, obviously with what I saw, is definitely a bit strange. This incident happened years ago, so I'm sorry if some information is a bit vague, but I'm just sharing what I can remember. So one day in the summer of 2017, it was a gloomy day at the start of our walk, but that's not relevant. Me and my bestie had decided to go for a hike. This time we decided to take the trail, even though we usually just walked wherever we wanted. But as we got to the bench, which was just over halfway up, we took a break. A young girl and her dog were jogging down the mountain. There was really nothing out of the ordinary, so we assumed that it was safe to go to the top. Once we got to the last turn before the top, I all of a sudden just got a really uneasy feeling. We continued, but near the top, there was a slope with lots of rocks and rubble, and I could see 3 or 4 men at the top conversing behind a bush of some sort. So I stopped dead in my tracks, and I then heard one of the men say frantically, hide the body bag." He said it just loud enough that me and my bestie knew what he had just said. My bestie took a couple of steps forward to see if it was just some teens messing with us, but it was a small group of men with a body bag. I never saw the bag, the body, or any of the men's faces. Me and my bestie just said quietly, "What do we do?" Then we gave each other the "get me the heck out of here" look, and we just booked it. None of the men followed us, thankfully, and we made it down the mountain safely. We ended up making a police report because my bestie saw the bag, the men, and also some old blood on the bag too. Despite the local police not believing us, they scraped the mountain. They originally didn't believe us and found nothing, but shortly after this encounter, a news report came out about an Australian guy that went missing, and his remains were found in my hometown. It was then that the pieces started to click. I personally believe that the man was killed way before they brought his body to the mountain to dispose of it. I mean, if you really think about it, they probably wanted the body to be found if they were stupid enough to ditch it on a public mountain with a hiking trail of all places. Of course, in the news report, they never said me and my bestie found the body because who would believe 2 teenagers, right? Plus, a search team had found the remains of the poor guy, so of course they're going to get all the credit. I still don't know to this day why this happened, but all I can say is that I'd never lie about witnessing something like this. It was truly messed up. So I don't know a ton about the history of my childhood home, but I know that it was old and one of the creepiest places that I've ever lived. It was a 4-story house, fancy, right? With lots of dark spaces and long stairways. Basically, it was really big. There wasn't a moment in that house that I felt like I was truly alone too, and there wasn't a hallway that felt truly empty. I was just barely out of toddlerhood when I started to develop severe anxiety. I was afraid to do anything alone. I was always checking behind me, sleeping with my head under the covers, seeing things, hearing things, you name it. I'm almost 100% sure that there was something paranormal making me feel this way at that time. And I wasn't the only one seeing and hearing things though too. My older brother shared a room with me, and he always slept on the top bunk. His bed was maybe a foot away from the ceiling, and the attic was right above us. And he told me that some nights, he would hear adult footsteps right above his head, just circling the attic. But it gets weirder still. He's told me that at one point, he woke up next to a shadowy figure just lying in the bed with him. He claims the figure had 2 white specks for eyes, and that it wasn't acting malicious, just sort of lying there silently. This might have been some kind of sleep paralysis hallucination, we know that, but considering the other events, I wouldn't be surprised if it was something else. And now, on to the main event, the playroom. That room was the creepiest thing in the house, and I get shivers just thinking about it. It sat at the end of a long hallway on the top floor, just below the attic. My room was down the hall from it, and it was always pitch black. I remember staying up at night staring at it just in case something moved. I often couldn't take my eyes away in fear of something appearing if I did. Somehow, every time that I looked at that doorway, the door was wide open, and the door wasn't weak either. It worked perfectly fine, and wouldn't open unless you turned the knob. I'd ask my dad to close it before I went to bed, and it would stay closed for a bit, until all of a sudden it would just slide open again. Now, I'm not a door specialist by any means, but it was arguably very creepy. But there's more to this as well. Now that we're older and out of that house, me and my brother found out that we shared a terrifying experience once. We both saw something incredibly creepy in the same place. I remember it vaguely. It was a small, neutral, glowing white face in the playroom. It looked a little bit like a kid from my memory, but it had no body, just a pure white face in the dark. It was around my height, and his eyes were kind of just, not there really. I don't remember much, but what I do remember is that it was the single most terrifying thing that I'd been through in that place. I don't know if I hallucinated or what, but I know that it felt incredibly real at the time. Maybe it was just a dream or something, because all I remember is seeing that face, getting scared and running back to my bed. I don't think that I screamed, but I just don't really remember too much. I kind of, love-hate thinking about it because it just makes my hair stand on edge. Anyway, thanks to that house, I have now been diagnosed with anxiety. I'm taking medication for it, and I'm alright, but I thought that was worth noting. I could go on as well about other things, but those were definitely the things that stand out the most. So, a couple of weeks ago, I was headed out to my family cemetery about 5 miles outside of town. I hadn't been out there since a couple of days after Christmas, right after I had learned that my dad had finally lost his battle with lung cancer. I've spent a lot of time at that cemetery in the last few years. I like to go out there and do audio recordings, and just for the fact that it's so peaceful out there, and well, it used to be anyway. You see, I've had some really bad experiences out there in the last couple of years. Have gotten some really nasty EVPs, and it turned into a very dark place at night. But that's a story for another time. Now, when I go out there, I always stop at a little country church about a mile down the road. The reason for this is because the church used to belong to my great-grandfather and my great-uncle, both of whom preached there, and I go there and ask for their protection and guidance before going to the cemetery, but on this night, I changed my pattern for some reason. Instead of going to the church first, I drove on past the cemetery about maybe a half mile to some property that my aunt and uncle own. There's a small creek that runs along the road, and just before you get to the creek is where my life started out at, the old homestead. Now, at the bottom of the hill, the creek sort of crosses under the road and makes a sharp turn to continue following the road. In that turn is what used to be a pretty deep hole. My mum and dad grew up right down the road from there, and all my family used to swim in that hole and fish. It's been a very long time since my parents and my uncle and even me have swam there. As a matter of fact, over the years that hole is filled in and sort of is no more, just a shallow bend in the creek. But back in the day, one of my uncle's high school friends drowned there. My uncle also drowned there, but they were able to revive him, thank God. So, anyway, when I arrived there, I backed my truck into the drive. I was barely off the roadway and left my headlights on and the motor running. I was only going to be there for maybe a minute. I started to record a video with my iPhone and was describing why I was going to the cemetery. Now, during all of this, at one point, I could have sworn that I saw something pop up from the creek and then go back down really quickly. However, I tried to ignore it and kept going on with my video. After a minute or so, it happened again though. I didn't miss a beat though, and I kept on filming, but noted that it appeared to be a figure of human nature, but sort of greyish white, kind of skinny, but I didn't see its face. Once again, I kept right on going, trying to ignore what I had seen, and then it happened a third time. but this time it looked more grey than white, and there was no face. And at that moment, the feeling of something dark, unfriendly and mad that I was there washed over me all of a sudden, and every hair on my body stood straight on end. I start saying, "This isn't good," repeatedly, and then I got the feeling that something aggressive and really mad was approaching very quickly. It's hard to describe, but that's the feeling that I got. And at that, I tried to get out of there as quickly as I could, but it wasn't quick enough. I don't know if you're familiar with the term, but if anyone is, then have you ever got what some call spirit jumped? It's where a spirit or entity jumps into your body. It's brief most of the time, but not brief enough. Your body goes into survival mode. Adrenaline dumps, but not like a normal adrenaline dump. This is like 10 times worse. It may also feel like your breath is sort of sucked right out of your lungs, and it's a struggle to breathe in any air. It's really scary when it happens, but you also feel like something evil has reached into your body and grabbed your soul all of a sudden. It's a very demanding warning to get the heck away, and that they mean business. So when I pulled out of there, I headed straight up the road to the church, but before I could get there, I heard a very ominous growl over my left shoulder and got hit a second time. This was much worse than the first time too. I became very vocal and demanded that it get away and get out of my truck, but whatever it was, it must have stayed there until I reached the church. But when I pulled in, I called upon my great-grandfather for help. Then I was hit a third time. It was brief, but the point was gotten across to me. All of a sudden, I could then feel everything lighten up, as they say. The hairs went down, and I became relaxed fairly quickly. I left the church soon after, and I went back home, where I had my daughter bring out my Bible, and I didn't go inside until I was certain that whatever it was had left me. The next evening, I went to the family cemetery, stopping at the church first, of course. I used the Necrophonic app, which I use quite a bit from time to time. I didn't even ask about the night before, but I was told that there was evil at the creek. Stay away from the water. They call it dark water. I had never, in almost 3 years of using that app, ever gotten those responses, or any mentions of water or dark water. And no, I was not under the influence of anything. I take no medications, and other than some post-traumatic stress disorder, I have no mental health issues. Nothing that would cause this, at least. This particular area is pretty rural. The area had a lot of Native American activity, and is within 300 feet of a known burial ground, as well as another cemetery that has long been forgotten. As a kid, the woods around this area always seemed to have a dark side. We always felt watched when we were playing in the woods around there. There is also a piece of property within maybe a quarter mile that was rumored as apparently being owned by a witch. So this was back about 12 years ago. I was 19 years old, 32 now, and my dumb ass decided that it was a great idea to join the group of people who came to my door to try and sell magazines. I had just gotten out of a relationship and wasn't working, so why not, right? To start, it was shady as heck, but I didn't care. They all partied and made a few bucks to boot. I thought, what could go wrong? I started in New Hampshire, and by the second week was across the country in some hillbilly town in Alabama. I walk up to this woman sitting on her porch, and I try to sell her some magazines. I notice that she's drinking and ask if I could have one. I'm almost done with my sales for the day after all. The woman is about 5'9", I guess, 300 pounds, maybe around age 40 to 50 if I had to guess. I don't think much of it. I mean, it's a woman, I'm a woman, what could go wrong? I walk into a house and I see a huge cage with a wolf in it. Yeah, a wolf growling at me. Still, I'm pretty ballsy, so I don't think much of it. The woman offers me a drink and we small talk, and before I know it, she is in my face accusing me of stealing her wallet. I hadn't left her sight, mind you, but she threatens to let her wolf out. I am literally in shock because I now know that she is a complete psycho. After about 10 minutes of her threatening my life, me crying, saying that I'm not a thief, she then just starts laughing. She says, "How old are you?" I tell her my age. She then goes on to say that this is a life lesson. Don't go into strangers' houses. She apparently knew exactly where her wallet was the whole time. She then tells me to get the heck out of her house and leave this neighborhood and never come back. And all I can say is, well, I guess she had good intentions, but for 10 minutes of my life, I genuinely thought that I was a wolf's dinner and an old hick lady's amusement. So I just recently moved to Oklahoma, and I keep having very uncomfortable experiences outside, especially in the evening or nighttime. It started when I went to go out to put laundry in the wash one day. We have a laundry room attached to our building, and it was broad daylight, so I wasn't exactly feeling nervous about anything. I got about 20 feet from the walkway or alleyway to the washroom, and I smelled the worst rotting animal smell that I've ever smelt in my life. Not only that though, but as soon as I smelt it, I got the strongest flight or fight reaction that I've ever felt. I ran back to my unit, locked the door, and had a sort of small anxiety attack, I guess. I waited about 15 to 20 minutes before going back out, and when I did, there was no smell and I felt normal. Well, fast forward about a week later, my husband and I were outside at 1 a.m. smoking a cigarette when we heard what sounded like a dying dog. We live right off of one of the major interstates, so we assumed an animal must have been hit. We started walking towards the direction of this noise, sort of wheezing and whining, a terribly sad noise. But when we got to the edge of the parking lot, as we got onto the pavement, the wheezing dog noise turned into what sounded like an owl hooting. I understand owls making strange noises. I was raised in Texas after all. I've heard many, but this was not an owl. The longer we listened to it as well, the more it sounded like a person trying to mimic an owl. My husband called out, "Hey, is somebody there?" pretty loudly, and just silence was the response. We stood quiet a few moments before the owl noise completely stopped, and the sound of an unnatural laugh echoed from the trees. Now, the only way that I can describe this noise is it was like when a deaf person laughs. Like they can't hear how they sound, so it just kind of sounds a bit off. I don't mean to sound rude at all by any means, truly. That's just really the only way that I know how to describe sort of what it sounded like. It felt like ice water was in my veins, though, as soon as I heard it. Both of us just felt extreme fear in that moment, and we ran back into the house. And I could explain off all of these things if I hadn't seen what I had seen next. So a few days later, I was outside smoking around 7 p.m, and I saw two men walking on the side of the street where I had heard the noise a few nights prior. They walked past the trees a little ways, but then stopped. It was dusk, so light was low. One of them turned on their phone light and shined it into the trees before sort of jumping back. Both men took off at full sprint away from the tree line. I have no idea what they saw. I didn't hear anything, but there was pure fear there. The most frustrating part, though, was I was looking right at them and I saw absolutely nothing. Fast forward about a week later, though, and I get a text while I'm at work from my husband telling me that he heard our daughter talking and laughing in the field across the street. He was 100% sure it was her until he realized that she was inside of her room. He said, though, that it sounded just like her. Fast forward again a few days later, and I found dried blood on my door jamb, as well as scratches near my doorknob, and more dried blood at the bottom of my door. My neighbor, too, had their internet cables cut and told me that someone had tried to open their door the night that it happened, and then slammed their body against the door trying to break in. My neighbor said that he forced himself out the door ready to confront whoever was there, but when they did, there was no one. Mind you, they had just popped out, just after whatever was banging on their door slammed against it, so that just makes no sense. we constantly hear things on the roof too, things in the valley behind our place. Our dog will run to the door at random hours and sniff and growl like somebody is there. I've probably made a mistake by calling out to this thing, whistling at night, trying to sort of antagonize it, I guess, because I desperately want a recording. I have one recording of its noises, and it sounds just like an owl, but towards the end there's this sort of low, inexplicable moan that comes from the same place the owl's sounds are coming from. It's hard to hear it and ends very abruptly, so I don't feel like it's good enough. But nobody believes me. But I know something is out there. It knows that I know it too. I feel it sort of watching me. If I curse at it or try and lure it out, it goes completely silent or does that horrible laugh. I can never seem to catch the laugh too, or any of the noises. As soon as I hit record, it usually just stops. I don't know how to explain that too, but I know that I'm not going crazy. Anyway, please, if someone can help me, I really want to know what this thing is. I have pictures of the blood on my door, the scratches, and the video of the owl, the sounds and the moaning. I just feel like no one would take this seriously, though. It always smells like a corpse when it's around, too, and that's the biggest sign that something just isn't right. I brought it up to one of my native co-workers, and he said, "Leave it be, wash the blood from your door, and stop trying to talk to it." He wouldn't tell me anything else. I don't know if this means that it's a Wendigo or a skinwalker or something else entirely, but I've never felt such, dread and fear as I do when I hear or smell it out there. Please, anyone, if you know what this is, then please tell me I'm not losing my mind, and if it's real, how do I make it go away? This thing is causing me so much stress, and I've just had enough, and I want this to end. So I'm 20 now, and this took place when I was 13 to 14 years old. I think it's also important that I note that I've always been a bigger, older-looking guy. At the time of this story, I was roughly 6'1", 200 pounds, and was in moderately decent shape since it was football season. I guess I just thought since I was such a big guy, nothing could ever happen to me. But this story is about the night that proved me wrong. So one night, I had gotten into an argument with my parents and needed to take a walk to blow off some steam. I had set a route I'd usually take to get to this park located on the other side of my neighborhood. By the time that I arrived at the park, nightfall had fully set in. I made my way to the only lit-up corner of the park, sat down at a bench, and began listening to my music on my phone. I should note that I was completely comfortable dropping my guard, as this was during a time when my relationship with my family was a bit strained, so coming here had become something of a regular occurrence. A few songs in, I noticed a car pull up on the unlit side of the park, which proceeded to immediately turn its headlights off. It was a silver SUV, but I couldn't tell what model or how many people were in the vehicle from where I was sitting. I didn't think much of it at first, as this really wasn't anything out of the ordinary. My neighborhood is rather large and divided into multiple parts, so people would frequently get lost trying to navigate it. I simply assumed that the driver had stopped to pull up directions on their phone or something. But a good nearly 10 minutes would pass and the vehicle still hadn't moved, which began to make me a bit nervous for some reason. The thought crossed my mind that whoever was in that car may be watching me, and as unlikely as that thought seemed, it was enough to get me to leave the park. As I was getting up, the vehicle turned its headlights back on, and at that, a sick feeling formed in my stomach, and I quickly made my way out of the park, breaking my usual route to ensure that I didn't have to go near that car. At this point, I didn't know what to do, to be honest. I wanted to call my mum to come and pick me up, but given the argument that we just had, I stupidly convinced myself that calling her wouldn't be the right thing to do. I made my way to the end of the block, mentally preparing myself to wrap around the block and start heading back in the direction of the park that was my only way home. Just seconds later, though, as I reached the end of the block, the same car pulled out in front of me and came to a screeching stop. Not quite processing what was happening, I simply stopped walking and watched as the driver, an older man with a baseball cap and an unsettling smile that I could just barely make out in the darkness of his car, says, "Hey, you okay, buddy? You need a ride somewhere?" There wasn't anything out of the ordinary about his voice, but as he spoke to me, my stomach tied itself in knots. All I could do was mutter out a soft no before the man reached all the way over and opened the passenger side door. "Hop in, we can go anywhere you like, buddy." Snapping out of my state of shock, I darted off behind the car without saying another word. I heard the man try to call out to me as I had started running, but I couldn't make it out. I heard his car speed off as I continued trying to put as much distance between me and him as I possibly could. I made it a good few blocks away before I felt comfortable enough to stop running and decided to finally start making my way back home. Not long after, though, I heard a car coming up behind me in a quick stop, which made my heart feel like it was about to shoot out of my chest. My nerves settled pretty quickly as I realized that it was my mum, who set out to look for me after I didn't come home. She rolled down her window and began yelling at me to get in the car, but something was off in her voice. She didn't sound angry, but more panicked, I guess. I did as she said, asking what was wrong as we pulled off, and she told me that she had just been by the park to look for me and saw a car which had the same description as the one that I encountered, partially blocking the road to shine its headlights into the park. She says that as she pulled up, the car quickly pulled back out and sped off. Call it mother's intuition, I guess, but she immediately assumed that I was involved somehow. Though I denied anything happening, as I've never really been someone who can talk about anything real with my family, my mum still reported the car to the police, and that was that. I've never told my family what really happened, and haven't really ever spoken about this until, well, now, really. This situation didn't stop me from going out for walks when I needed to de-stress, and I guess you can just credit that to me being a stupid teenage boy. I was certainly more cautious of my surroundings, but like I said, that was that. I never saw the man again, and I moved on with my life. I can look back now, though, and use this as an interesting story to tell people, I guess, but I truly was incredibly lucky to get out of that situation unharmed, I think. Who knows what would have happened if I hadn't decided to leave that park, or if I hadn't been able to get away. Would I really have been able to bring myself to fight back if needed? Maybe I wouldn't be here now, or maybe I'd be left with much, much worse memories of that night. All I can say without a doubt is that that man had truly awful intentions. Of that much I'm sure, and I am very lucky to be here now. Moral of the story: be careful when you go out for walks at night. Always be aware of your surroundings. It doesn't matter who you are, how big you are. Anything can happen if someone has bad enough intentions. So, we were going on a hike one day, and there's this spooky abandoned train tunnel in my state where a bunch of people died like 100 years ago, so now it's allegedly haunted. I brought one friend with me on the hike since it was a long one. The area and the scenery were beautiful, but the tunnel itself was something else. My buddy, his name is Ed, was a bit more nervous than me and didn't want to go too far in. I wanted to go as far as I could, which turned out not to be far because the tunnel was blocked by impassable debris. But wait, there was a small hole on the side of the debris mound, and it turns out that I could crawl through it. So I asked, "Hey Ed, you feel like crawling?" "Nah, no thanks, dude." So I took my pack off and coat and I squirmed through on my own. On the other side was the rest of the tunnel, but with water that went up to nearly the top of the mound on the other side, as far as the eye can see. I was disappointed too, because I would have to swim in ice-cold, nasty water for who knows how long to keep exploring. So I decided no and to crawl back. My buddy Ed was nervous, but we weren't done yet. Next, we busted out just one tool for detecting ghosts, an EMF reader. As someone who is pretty scientific, I guess you could say, I tested it multiple times and made sure that it was working before bringing it. We decided to try and contact ghosts in the tunnel. I was pretty confident nothing would happen. We turned off all of our electronics and lights so it was pitch black and just the EMF reader on. I asked pretty basic questions, I guess you could say, to the ghosts. Asked it to come in front of my scanner so I'd know that it was there, etc. We did this for a while too, and there was nothing. No reading, no surprise, and so we headed back. We decided to keep my EMF reader on, and then as we're sort of walking back, suddenly it goes to 2 lights. I thought maybe our flashlights were causing it, so we turned them off. But no, still 2 lights. I reset the device, 2 solid lights. I say, that's interesting, maybe something's here. My adrenaline started flowing into my body now, but I was still skeptical. I started asking it questions again, and then my EMF signal got even stronger. And we both were getting chills, and the hairs on our skin were standing up. And it was around this time that we heard something. Kind of sounded like a distant cough, I guess you could say, but it was so fast that it was easy to dismiss it. I reset the device again, still getting a strong signal from something, and it's definitely not coming from us. I then said, "Is it alright if we stay in the tunnel with you a bit longer?" The meter instantly went back to 0. I was surprised, but confident now. I asked, "Do you want us to leave?" Then it instantly went back up to high. I was pretty convinced at this point, so we headed for the entrance to the tunnel and we discussed our experience. However, when we were at the entrance, we noticed that the EMF was picking up another signal just above and to the side of us now, and if you pointed it in a different direction, there was nothing. After that, we left, but we think that ghosts may have been hanging out by the entrance waiting for us to leave. You could always say that the EMF was faulty, I know that, or picking up something else, but I'm sure that that device was working. I tested it so many times before and after, and there was nothing on us producing the EMF reading. Also, considering that we didn't get any reading in there for the vast majority of the time that we were there, that says something too. But that cough of all things, that sounded so much like a person, and it was truly mind-boggling, and I'm still processing it. So this occurred a bit over a year ago now. Me and my girlfriend decided to have a date night at the beach, figuring that there'd be less people if we were there during the evening hours and it'd be cooler out. Important to note too is that we're both young women, 20 female and 23 female, but I in particular have a younger looking face. So, we came with our bathing suits, found a quiet area away from everyone, and put down our towel to hold hands and look at the stars and waves. It was a super nice time too until, well, the creep approached. Dude approached us from the direction of the general entrance area, looked about mid-30s. I'm going to try and paraphrase too here a bit, but he said something along the lines of, "Hey, me and my family are new to this area. My wife and my 4-year-old daughter want to sit with someone so we can be a little less lonely and make some friends. Can we sit with you guys?" It was weird vibes immediately. It was like 9:30 p.m. at this point, and we were distance away from people already hanging out here. Who would bring a 4-year-old out to a beach this late anyway? Why would you want to sit with some strangers, and why would a family choose to hang out with some college-aged women? This was clearly just made-up stuff, and also, of course, no woman and child matching that description was in sight. My girlfriend and I, we politely declined, but he becomes more and more insistent and animated. I start to panic and fumble for my pepper spray in my tote bag. I was nervous and trying to be discreet, but it took an agonizing amount of time to find it at the bottom of our towels. Somehow he didn't notice, and once I had it clutched, we got a little more bold, trying to get him to go. Girlfriend lies and says that we're underage. The guy gets visibly mad at this and says, "No, you're not." I respond, spray in hand, "Dude, you need to leave." And the look that he gave us was the absolute scariest thing. He took a step back and looked at both of us like he was sizing us up. Then he goes, "You guys are liars," and wanders away. We watch him, and the dude does not return to a wife and kid. Me and my girlfriend go back to our car ASAP, and we called the police. The sketchy vibe was unreal, and we gave them his description, and we just took off. As far as we know, nothing ever came of it, and the question that we still have is, what was this dude trying to do? He wasn't under the influence as far as we could tell, and his story seemed so rehearsed. But we still theorize on what his plan was, and neither of us came to reach a conclusion about what could have happened that night. And I'm sharing this because I would like your thoughts and theories. What do you think he was up to? So, for context, this happened 20 years ago, just after Christmas. I had just turned 6 a month prior. My mum went out one day and left my then 16-year-old cousin to look after me and my 2 older siblings, brother 8 and sister 11. My cousin decided to take us out to the city, which is about 10 minutes from where we lived. We took the bus, walked around the city in incredibly unsafe neighborhoods with basically another child responsible for us, and after hours got tired and decided to go home. The city had a central area for the buses, not a bus station, but like a sort of huge perfectly square field with some plants and flowers and bushes. Lining all 4 sides along the streets were a couple bus stops and benches, so basically you could catch several different buses from that area going all over the county or city. Since it was just after Christmas too, the bushes along the field were still covered in Christmas lights. As we waited for the bus, I began to wander away as I admired the lights, my cousin none the wiser. And at some point, I heard a man say hi. I looked up from the bush and he was smiling down at me. Thinking back on it once I got older, it was clear that he was homeless and was probably on drugs too. He had long brownish sort of hair that was wet, teeth that were black along the gums, and his clothes were incredibly dirty and torn, and he had several jackets on. None of this really registered in my 6-year-old brain, so I just smiled back and said hi. He asked if I liked looking at the lights, and I said yes, they're pretty. He said, and I'll never forget this exact sentence, "If you like Christmas lights, I've got some really cool lights at my house that you'll love. You want to come and see them?" I eagerly said yes, so he reached down his hand to me and I took it. We started to walk away and were headed to the corner of the field where a few big buildings were. He said his apartment was just a couple of blocks away, so we were headed around the corner of the building when my arm jerked backwards and I turned to see my sister pulling me away from him. This guy too, he didn't say a single word. He just took off, instantly running. It took a few years for me to fully grasp the danger that I was in that day. My sister and brother talked about what happened a lot and how scary it was. When I finally got a little bit older, I appreciated how terrifying that all was and how close I was to having my life change or perhaps even end forever. If I had rounded that city corner with him, they never would have been able to find me in time because they wouldn't even know where to start looking before we disappeared around the corner and into the city. It's something that we still bring up sometimes to this day, and it always makes me feel really icky. On my 19th birthday in September of 2014, I'd moved into my first home, a small one-bed flat. I was beyond excited to have the freedom and independence that living alone would offer me, and quickly set out about buying new furniture, decorations, and items for my new home. One afternoon on the bus home after a trip into my local town to buy more household items, an elderly gentleman, in his late 60s if I had to guess, started speaking to me. I've always been a social person that'll pretty much gladly speak to whoever speaks to me, so I engaged him in the conversation. Just sort of polite chit-chat about what we'd been up to that day, what our plans were for the rest of it. But upon reaching the stop that I'd be getting off at, he told me that he was also getting off at this stop as he was visiting a friend who lived in a neighbouring block of flats. He offered to help me carry my shopping, and I agreed. I walked with him to the front of my block and said my goodbyes. He left towards a different block, and honestly, I thought that was that. He didn't enter my building or see which flat belonged to me, or so I thought at least. A few days later, I heard a knock upon my door. I opened it to find the same elderly gentleman standing outside my door. I was quite taken aback considering that he shouldn't have known which flat I actually lived in. He'd also managed to get into the building without ringing my doorbell. and the realization hit me that he would have had to have hidden out of sight to watch which flat that I entered. The block had large windows in the communal area. He quickly forced his way into my home and tried talking to me. I lied and stated that I was about to leave as my friends were expecting me, hoping that this would encourage him to go. He then started trying to grope me under my clothes, and I moved his hands away, but he kept trying to remove them. I ran to my front door and told him I'm leaving and you need to go. Luckily, he did, but he loitered. I waited to make sure that he'd walk away before walking in an opposite direction and immediately called my dad in tears. We rang the police, who were as unhelpful as they could possibly be, really. 2 female officers who asked me, "Why did you let him into the flat?" despite me saying that he'd forced his way in. They encouraged me to not press charges as the name and the address that he'd given me in our first exchange were falsified, telling me that it would be difficult to prove, a lot of paperwork, and you'd have to relive it in court if we did manage to find him. I regretfully agreed. I was shocked and scared, and the police already were so unsupportive anyway. But it doesn't end there, though. This man continued to stalk me for months, regularly appearing at my door, following me when I was out. It wasn't until he was on the same bus as me to town when I went to meet friends that it finally stopped, as this was the first time that I was able to point him out to somebody else. My friends went over and publicly called him out for stalking and harassing me. They threatened him, saying, "If we ever hear of you doing this again, you'll not be able to use those arms to abuse another person ever again. Leave our friend alone." He quickly scampered away, and thankfully, that was the last that I ever saw of him. But this incident, it shook me. It all happened simply because I was polite to a seemingly innocent elderly man who wanted to help me and make conversation. Needless to say, I've never accepted another offer of helping me carry my shopping ever again. I guess the lesson here is be careful who you let help you, because it might not be good intentions that they have in mind. So, what I just experienced is really hard for me to overlook. I guess what I'm trying to say is that you guys win. Ghosts are real. Twice now I've had a weird experience in the same place, my grandma's attic. Once a couple of years ago, and just 5 minutes ago the second time. Let me start with the prequel. To give you an idea, my grandma has a house, and the attic is basically like a second floor over the whole house. It's filled with all sorts of things that we dump up there that we don't need. Tools, firewood, old toys from childhoods, etc. Also up there is a short chair and a coffee table. When I take them out of the attic to the balcony, it's my favorite place to smoke in the house. Tobacco, not weed. I really enjoy the view and the wind, and sometimes, though, I'm just too lazy to bring them out, and I just smoke in the attic, looking around at all the junk. Now, one day, I was going to go up there, when, as soon as I stepped foot on the first stair, I got a sort of fight or flight response for seemingly no reason. It was the middle of the day. I've been in the attic 1,000 times. I'm not scared of it at all, in fact. I mean, I'm not a kid or anything, but for some reason I was just getting chills and my heart was beating quickly. As soon as I went up to the last step, I stopped and looked around the attic. I had nothing to be afraid of, but it was just sort of like instinct, I guess. I couldn't go into the attic without checking it out first. I spent like 30 seconds just looking into the attic in silence before the courage came back to me to walk forward. While walking towards the table for some reason, I had the thought of, what if a demon's watching me right now, and that's why I had a bad feeling? I instantly laughed it off though and thought to myself, let him show himself. I'll show him who's boss. And as soon as I finished that thought, I heard a loud shuffle like somebody's footsteps dragged out onto the ground. I instantly froze midway and just looked in the direction where they came from. I spent at least a minute just looking, frozen, expected a big rat or something to pop out from somewhere over there, and when I finally got my courage back again, as soon as I was about to continue to the table and finally do what I came for, another loud noise froze me. This time, a distorted piano played. And I kid you not, it was the most demonic, out-of-tune chord that you could imagine. Like a sound a horror movie producer would put on jump scare or something. On cue, I of course immediately dashed towards the stairs and I noped out of there quickly. I went downstairs, entered the room my family was in, and tried my best to pretend like I wasn't running from a demon. My mother heard the piano though, and she thought that I'd found my childhood toys and was fooling around with them. I went with that story and told her that, surprisingly, the batteries were still holding out. They must be good. I wasn't about to tell my family that I seriously thought that there was a demon in the attic. They would have looked at me like I was crazy. Anyway, after I spent a couple of minutes downstairs regaining my composure, I started to think about things rationally again. I felt ashamed that I got scared of nothing. I mean, I'm an adult, and so I picked up my small balls and went up there again, determined to find that piano and ease my mind forever. I went up, immediately walked up to the place where the sound came from, and picked up off the wall a big garbage bag filled with toys from my childhood. I started taking things out and found it. A cheap Chinese dingy toy piano. I tried pressing the keys, but to my shock, there was no sound. I flipped it around, opened the battery compartment, and had a brain fart when I saw that there were no batteries in that thing whatsoever. I took it down with me, found some batteries and put them in, tried playing it, but still no sound. Unfortunately, that day, I really failed to ease my mind. So over the next couple of weeks, I spent quite some time thinking about that incident. As time went on, I started rationalizing it more and more, I guess, thinking that maybe pianos like that make their final sound when their circuit board finally dies, kind of like parting words or whatever. Maybe the shuffle that I heard was from my own feet, but because of the fear it sounded like it was somebody else's. The only thing that I couldn't make sense of, though, was how this piano that has been in that garbage bag for 15 years found energy without batteries to make a sound out of its speakers, and a loud one at that. I even went looking for answers, hoping someone could ease my mind and offer an explanation at one point. In the end, as time went on, I guess I just brushed it off and told myself, I'm no engineer. I don't know how currents work and stuff. There could be some weird way that happened, and it was normal, and it was just a coincidence. I went to the attic countless times after that too, and nothing else ever happened. No weird sounds, no unexplained paranoia, just peace and quiet, as it always was. Well, that is, right until today. You see, recently, we've been doing construction work on the house every weekend. I go up to the attic 20 times a day at least to fetch something or to have a smoke break. We finished the work and went to bed. And now, before you accuse me of being a skeptic rationalizer, I try to keep an open mind. Recently, I've been getting into trying out astral projection, and it's a nice little meditation gig, I guess. I haven't succeeded yet, but the effects are quite trippy and it's fun. So, I'm laying in bed, browsing the AP subreddit, before I decide that I'm going to go up there to smoke one last cigarette before I go to sleep. The front door is loud and I don't smoke in the house, so the attic is really the only place that I can go. But, in the same exact way, as soon as I set foot on that first stair, I get this immense feeling that something is amiss. Now, some years have passed since the last time that this happened, and naturally, my small balls have grown at least a little bit, so I didn't stop this time. I just went up and sat on my smoke table. I lit my cigarette, remembered the last time that this happened in the piano. Like any sane person, I started a monologue in my head to banish the potential ghosts. My monologue continued until my cigarette went out, and here's a reaction. I don't know if there's demons up here or whatnot, but you can't spook me. I can't touch you right now, but I'm learning this technique that lets me come into your house. Trust me, tonight I'm coming and I'm gonna kill you, as revenge for when you scared me, etc., etc. Now is your last chance to try and scare me, so come on, just try it. And I put my cigarette out, quite amused of my own little internal monologue. And here we go again. As soon as I finished my monologue and said, "Try me," a loud sound as something on my left drags across the floor. This time, though, I caught it with my peripheral vision as I turned around. A sack, filled with dried sticks for the fireplace, was moving by itself across the floor, defying the laws of physics. Gravity cannot do that. There's no way that it could move that distance by itself, especially when there's so much friction that it made a loud sound. It's not that heavy, so it can't slide like that or even cause that friction unless somebody is pushing it from the top. At that, I shut up and stayed fixated on this thing, convinced not to let a rat, for example, run away without me seeing it. It didn't move for a couple of seconds, so I went up to it, took all the sticks out, checked every corner of that thing, and there were no rats inside. I put the sticks back in, said out loud, "Don't touch that again." I said my piece already, and I meant it. If there really was an evil entity up there, I'm going to banish it. Although at that point, I was starting to feel like I was bluffing. I walked back to the stairs, but before I went down, I stopped and looked back at the attic. And although my knees were weak, my arms were heavy, vomit on my sweaty, perhaps even Mum's spaghetti, I wasn't going to give in to my fear, so I stared into the void for a couple of seconds to establish my dominance. And again, as if a reply, the sack lightly got dragged, though this time just a little bit for a split second. I spent a couple more seconds looking at it, and then slowly backed away, went down the stairs with a confident walk, shaking a little, I'll admit. Originally, I was going to go to bed, but adrenaline got a little high, so now I'm sitting on the toilet writing this, maybe with a ghost proofreading over my shoulder, who knows. Anyway, this seemingly uneventful experience, I just found it too powerful to ignore. I don't think that I can ever rationalize it, to be honest. There's just too many things on top of each other, like the strong fight or flight reaction that I get before the event, the timing that makes this feel like a reply, the hard to explain sound and movement. I am now a believer, and I just can't rationalize things by myself anymore. I don't know if this spirit could be good or bad, so I won't take any extra measures right now, so please don't reply with throw salt on it or something. But unless I wake up with a cigarette burn on my cheek and come asking for help with how to banish a demon, then I guess this is how it is for now. I'm going to go upstairs again in a second to smoke one more cigarette and just feel out the vibe. I might spend some more time with monologues up there tomorrow as well, just to see what will happen, but for now, I really don't know what to make of all of this, and yeah, if you've got any ideas about how this could have happened in a sort of natural way, then I am all ears. Back in university days, I lived in a small 3-bedroom apartment with 2 other roommates. My apartment was on the topmost floor of the building, and also the last room on the floor, corner room. It was numbered 707. Our only neighbour is 706, which has been vacant for a while, so our side of the building is very quiet and sparse of people in general. There are 3 bedrooms which are adjourned in an upside-down sort of L shape, 1 room in the middle, 1 room to the left of it, and another room below it. For ease of storytelling, I'll call it the middle room, bottom room, and left room. My own room is the bottom room. Also, to be noted, these are Japanese rooms or buildings, so a wooden flooring, sliding doors, sliding closet inside the room, thin wood panel wall between rooms, all that jazz. The left room and the middle room both had heavy sliding doors as well. Between the middle room and my bottom room, there was a hollow space that is pretty large, a closet with sliding doors as well. It's the closet where you fold and store futons and such, and if you've ever watched Doraemon, then that's the same closet that he sleeps in. Anyway, the story happened on a summer vacation. The owner of the middle room had been away for a few days and won't be back until new semester started. One night, me and the left room owner were chilling in each of our rooms. Left room owner, we'll call her Lefty. She was supposed to leave for summer vacation in a week and has been packing. I kept hearing loud thuds and sounds of something heavy hitting the wall or the floor, but I ignored it because I assumed that she was still packing. About 11 o'clock at night, Lefty texted me, "Yumi, are you okay? Are you sick?" I was really confused. Lefty continued, "I kept hearing someone sneezing and coughing. Isn't that you?" I said, "No, I've been quiet this entire time. Isn't it you who's been moving around and packing boxes?" Lefty said, "What? I haven't been packing anything at all today. I've been on my bed playing with my phone the entire time." Immediately, I put down my headset and laptop and just sort of sat straight on my bed, looking at the text on my phone, feeling somewhat disturbed. About 5 minutes later, Lefty came to my room and we both sat together confirming with each other what we heard. She heard someone sniffling and sneezing, but I heard thuds and the sound of something on the floor, like the sound of boxes or something pushed against the floor. We sat in silence in my room and the sound came again. There was a thud and knocks. We looked at each other. We figured it out. She thought the sound came from me, and I thought that it came from her. In between our two rooms, the common space is the unoccupied middle room. There was knocking, thuds, sounds of boxes moving, and there were the sound of footsteps for sure. It sounds like a very active person inside the room, pretty much the entire night. Neither one of us wanted to go and check it out, so we tried to ignore it and just slept it through. Fast forward to the morning. Lefty is an early riser, while I don't wake up until 9 or 10 typically. My bed is on the right side of the door, but I sleep facing the door. I just woke up and I heard a loud thud and footsteps from outside my room, like someone was running, and I saw a short shadow passing through the cracks of my slightly open door. It took my sleepy brain a little while to process this. Running footstep sounds are pretty common because my room is beside the front door, so every school day my roommates would make this commotion outside of my door anyway when they're going out of the house. However, the first thing that I finally noticed was that it was summer vacation, so who would be running in a rush like this on the hallway? The second thing too is that shadow looked too short to be my roommate. It was the height of a child, if anything. The third, I can see the shadow through the cracks of my slightly open door. So, who opened my door? I don't sleep with my door opened. Feeling scared, I immediately texted Lefty and asked her where she was. She said that she had left the house since 7:30 in the morning because it's Sunday and church and all that, and currently she's about to get lunch. She didn't open my door. She didn't touch my room, in fact. It was closed when she left, apparently. I immediately got up and ran out of the house to meet Lefty and told her about it this morning. We decided to drag another friend and ask him to help us check our apartment to see if there's anything or someone in there. The three of us walked into the apartment and towards the middle room. We noticed something weird though. The door was slightly opened. It was a sliding door and quite heavy, so there was no way that it could open by itself. We confirmed that neither me nor Lefty had touched that door since the owner left last week. It was always closed. Our friend opened the door, and we immediately felt chills. He asked where did we hear the sound coming from, and I said from my room it sounds like it came very close, right on the wall connected between my bottom room and the middle room. That's when we realized too that the wall connected between my room and this middle room, where we heard all of this activity, it was inside the closet. My parents would have never allowed for a real Ouija board in the house when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s. Sex, drugs, and violence were fine as entertainment, but my seemingly unreligious parents had this weird distance between anything occult or what they would call satanic. And yes, that's exactly how they said the word too. So, maybe 14, mid-90s, hanging out with my band, who were just two guys that didn't know how to play instruments, like me, and we just hung out and daydreamed about being rock stars and all that. Think sort of Wild Stallions from Bill and Ted sort of thing. We got on the subject of witchcraft and Ouija boards came up, and I had the idea to make one after hearing from the goth chick on the bus that they could be more powerful that way. So I got a rectangle cardboard piece and made the most crude Ouija board that I could from memory. The other guys had only seen them in stores like me, so we just kind of put things on as we remembered them. So we made a little planchette out of some thicker cardboard and got to seancing. We asked the standard, "Are you there?" sort of questions. The planchette moved and we got answers that made no sense. Seemingly random letters and a few numbers that didn't form words or anything meaningful, I guess. We all assumed that one of us was sabotaging the whole thing. But then I asked if there was anything that we could do to help us understand. With zero hesitation, the planchette darted to the moon and then just as quickly over to the sun image. It felt like we all almost lost our place on the planchette because it was definitely moving on its own at this point. And then it slowly spelled out DESREVER, before making 3 quick circles around the center of the cardboard, sort of counterclockwise, and darting to goodbye. We all kind of sat there with our mouths open for a minute. Bass player said, "I only remembered to write down the last letters that it gave us. What does des rever mean?" Me being a first-year French language student thought that it was des revere, and I confidently assumed that it meant the rivers, but I knew that I had no clue. But then the keyboard player says, "Guys, it says reversed," as in it was spelt backwards, but the word was reversed. We left to see for ourselves if we had the sun and the moon reversed, and we walked downtown to the nearest department store, and sure enough, the one that we made was almost perfect to the one in the store, that is, except for the one major detail. The sun and the moon were indeed incorrectly placed on my homemade Ouija board. We ran home promptly, and after that, we burnt it in the fireplace. And never again. I live in Melbourne, Australia, and there used to be a mental asylum called Laurendale built in 1938, but eventually closed down in 1999. I was told about this place and how haunted it was, with people hearing creepy things. I was keen to check it out myself, and more than 10 years later, I still can't explain what happened in those 3 or so minutes that we were there. So, it was 2011. One night we drummed up this stupid idea because we were bored and had nothing to do. So me and 3 mates decided to go and check out Laurendale because, why not? The asylum at the time we went was being prepared to be demolished or renovated for new apartments, so most of the entrances and the windows were boarded up with wood. The building we parked next to was surrounded by a metal makeshift fence to keep people or squatters out, I guess, and had a security patrolling the grounds. One of my friends was strong enough to lift the metal fence that wasn't properly attached, which allowed us to crawl under and get inside the property grounds. It was all fun and games. We were having a good time. The feeling of doing something that you're not allowed to and trying not to get caught. You know the feeling, right? Anyway, we were constantly on the lookout for the security officer patrolling, but also trying to look for a doorway inside. When we finally found one, we one by one walked inside. Scared, mind you, we all put our torches on our phones on and shined the light inside so that we could see. When we walked in the door, it's a sort of small entrance area that leads into a main room. We walked a little closer to the main room to get a better look. There were no windows that we could see, just a simple room. This all happened in like 30 seconds, so we didn't get a proper look, but in front of us on the left was a staircase. I think it was leading up to other rooms and stuff, and all the walls were covered in graffiti. We didn't see anything paranormal. It was scary enough just being there, to be honest. It had only been 10-15 seconds of us standing there when we suddenly heard footsteps approaching. The crunching sound of gravel grew closer and closer from behind us outside. We immediately shut off our torches and were left standing there huddled together in the darkness. We couldn't see anything. In fact, I might as well have had my eyes closed, but they were wide open expecting someone or something to grab me. But we had our backs to the door behind us, waiting for the footsteps to hopefully walk by us, thinking that the security guard must have seen us. As the crunching of the gravel was fast approaching us, We all instinctively held each other's hand, waiting for the security to bust us. We stopped breathing as the footsteps came to a halt behind us. The sound was unmistakable. The crunching of the gravel stopped, and we just stood there. That silence was deafening, the darkness swallowing us. None of us were turning around. It felt like an eternity, but we stood there for about 10 seconds waiting for something, anything. A sound or someone to say something behind us or a torch to shine in on us from outside. But nothing. In fact, it wasn't until one of my friends turned around slowly and there was nothing or nobody there. He finally broke the silence and said, "Let's get out of here," and we bolted out of the door and back to our car. Neither of us saw the security as we raced out of the door as well. We got in the car and left, and after that we never went back. Still, 10 plus years later, I think about those footsteps and how no one was there when we turned around. We never heard the footsteps receding too, as we stood there in the silent darkness. Even if it was a weird prank and someone was there too, we would have heard the footsteps running away. It was also eerily quiet, so quiet that you could have heard a pin drop. It just stopped directly behind us, and it's something that I'll never be able to explain. And we all remember it exactly the same way too. I wrestled with the memory for a while, thinking that I was just misremembering it, but after checking with my mates again after so long, we heard those footsteps behind us. There was no doubt about it. Chalking it down to a scary, unexplainable moment that could have gone very differently if we stayed to investigate, the whole experience was eerie and really unsettling from the moment that we shut our torches off and were left standing there in complete darkness. The very first time I saw these things, I was around 6 or 7 years old. My family was camping at some lake in Oklahoma, and I saw two strange figures. I was standing outside our camper, alone, and I saw a ghostly white figure. It looked like a preteen girl with long hair and a gown, running into the woods, chased by a tall, thin black figure. I froze and called for my dad, who went into the woods where I saw these things, but he saw no footprints or anything. So I moved into a rural property in 2015, and it was my home. In January of 2016, aged 11, I was standing outside and just kind of staring out of the trees on the property. For a solid 3 seconds, though, I made eye contact with this abnormally tall, emaciated, pitch-black humanoid. I use quotations around eye contact, seeing as it had no eyes. It was just hanging upside down by its knees from a tree branch. Its long arms were touching the ground. If I had to guess, I'd say it was around 7 to 10 feet tall. But I felt a deep sense of dread, and I ran inside to tell my dad. When he came back out a few seconds later, it was gone. I hadn't started seeing them again as well until just recently, starting in September. On September 28th, my boyfriend, brother, and I were down from the road from my house trying to catch fish at a bridge. I got bored and a bit uncomfy because there were gnats, so I started walking up the road back to my house. I was about halfway there when I saw the figure standing in the center of the road. I froze, it froze, and we stood there for about maybe a minute or two. It was around 9 feet tall, and its hands nearly touched the ground. I ran back to the bridge, and I waited to walk back home with my brother and my boyfriend. I didn't speak for a solid 2 hours after that as well. 2 days ago as well, I was closing the blinds to a window that my cat enjoys perching at, and one of them was straight outside of the window. It had its face inches from the glass. It seemed to sort of open its mouth. I don't know why this one had a mouth, but in its mouth was a huge bulging eye. I freaked out and curled up in my bed, and I didn't sleep that night. And today I saw it peeking around a corner in my living room. I don't know what to do, and I'm absolutely terrified. Does Anyone know anything about this, and is there anything that I can do about it? I live in Pennsylvania, and there's this creepy house called Raymeyer's Hollow, where a murder took place in 1928. On one afternoon, I was hanging out with two of my friends, and we were really not doing anything. This was like 4 years ago, and we were just bored teenagers. So I mentioned checking out that house, and they never heard about it, so once they heard the backstory about it, they were down to visit it. When we got there, it was pretty light out. It was about maybe an hour away from us. We looked around and imagining where everything took place and just talking about the history of it and all that. If you're from Pennsylvania, then you'll probably know this place. You know that they upped the security over the years there, so we were being respectful and just sort of admiring the property. Once we decided to leave, my friend backed out and we went the wrong way. He ended up coming to a dead end and had to back up into someone's driveway. I was in the back seat, had my head looking out the back window to make sure that he was all good, when out of nowhere, there was this woman there. Long black hair, piercing black eyes, and a white dress, staring at me and keeping eye contact in the doorway of this house. I turned around, freaked out. With tears in my eyes, I looked back, and when I did, there was nobody there. Now, I had to have only looked away for possibly 2 seconds at most. My friend who was backing up told me that he didn't see anything. My other friend was looking down at his phone, so clearly he didn't see anything. But somehow, I was the only one who witnessed her. I've never felt fear like that before too. The way that she was looking at me, it will never leave my mind. I don't know if I just saw a creepy woman squatting there or if I saw something paranormal, but whoever or whatever it was, it gave me a fright that I'll never forget. I grew up out in the wooded country in Illinois, on a short dead-end street 10 plus miles from a town, and there were 7 houses in the area spread out on 2.5 acres of wooded lots, or larger even. There were no large wild animals. There aren't bears or similar large animals in the region, and people didn't meander there or show up lost or anything like that. Actually, lost folks or large animals wandering around never happened in the 20 years that I lived there. So please keep that in mind as I tell my story. So when I was a young girl in my early teens, I had a good guy friend a few years older than me who lived next door, Terry. Terry was allowed to go out with his friends much later than I was, and he would sometimes tromp over to my yard after getting home late and throw rocks from gravel area outside at my window just to chat. My bed was right next to the window, and I would open the window and we'd sort of whisper stories and generally talk for a bit. My second story window faced our backyard, and his house was to the side of it. I could see his house from my window, in fact, over the shrub trees and walking path to his driveway. I would often know if he was out too. The light was on over the side door entrance, or if he was already home, the light would always be off. Now, one time, during the summer when my window was open, I heard a car in his driveway dropping him off. I was probably 14 years old, and it was around midnight. I heard Terry get out of the car and was talking to his friends. Soon his friends pulled away, and I softly called out, as loud as I could without waking my parents, asking Terry to stop by and chat. He didn't respond though, as he probably didn't hear me, and then I came up with the not-so-brilliant idea to sneak outside and scare him. I'd spent many years in the woods and learning how to blend in and be silent. As kids, we would often sneak around and scare each other. So I silently sneaked out from the second floor and out of my back garage door, which led to our backyard below my window, which also led to Terry's house off the side, through our gravel area, then through a well-worn path through the woods about maybe 25 feet long. My parents had put in a gravel pit around the back of the house, probably because nothing much grew to the shade of the oak trees. There were 14-inch oak rounds set out as an uneven stepping path in the gravel, and if you stepped off onto the rounds, the crunch of the gravel rocks would give you away. But I picked up my way expertly and silently across the log rounds facing Terry's house. My eyes got accustomed to the dark, and I didn't see him. Also at that time, I heard the door of his house close and the light going off, signaling that he went in, likely to bed. I waited a bit as I thought that I saw something move in the woods between our houses, but not on the path that we'd always use. If you didn't use the path, there were wild roses and raspberry plants that had thorns and were painful to walk through if you weren't careful. So I thought that it was odd that he'd be in the woods, but maybe he wanted to scare me like I was plotting to do to him or something. But I saw something human-sized and dark, moving through the woods slowly and pausing every once in a while like me. It was coming closer, and I definitely saw it, but it was strange in that it wasn't walking directly to my window to talk. Therefore, I hunched down and waited in silence, wondering if I could still startle him. I still thought that it was Terry, and he saw me and snuck out, and he was trying to scare me. I watched a dark outline of a human figure moving, but then I would lose sight of it in the foliage. It seemed to be stalking slowly and listening or checking every few feet while hiding. So I whispered after losing patience one last time for Terry, but he didn't answer. I got bored of hiding and crouching, so I quietly tiptoed back to my garage door and went back inside, silently looking up as I went. I snuck back upstairs to my room above the area where I was just standing or crouching. My window was open, and I definitely heard someone or something walking around the yard. I whispered again for Terry out of my window, but got no answer. Then I heard someone or something fall and grunt or moan pretty loudly in the window well, right below my window. It wasn't enough to wake my parents, but definitely loud enough that I didn't mistake it, and it sent a shock of fear through me. If you aren't familiar with a window well, it's a semicircle hole connected to the house, dug out about 3 or 4 feet deep and reinforced with metal. It allows a basement window to be put in below ground level, and the hole lets some natural light in. But there was no way Terry would have fallen into our window well. We had been playing hide and seek and many outdoor games for years since we were young, around the whole neighborhood. We knew everybody's window wells and house footprints, plus paths in the woods, like the back of our hands. And the grunt sounded humanish and not like an animal. It also pulled itself out quietly without a lot of thrashing. It was around this time, too, that was when I realized that this wasn't a fun game and somebody or something was out there, and it wasn't Terry. I tried to look outside my window as best as I could, but there was a screen on my windows to keep the bugs out, so I couldn't lean my head out the window to see next to the wall of our house directly below me. I then heard the crunch of rocks or whatever as it was stepping in this noisy gravel. Again, Terry would know where the log rounds were and would not step in the gravel. He knew my parents were pretty strict, and he was as good at being quiet as I was. Whatever it was, though, it stopped, and I held my breath. I pretty much sat there with my face pressed against the screen, 2 stories up, for probably half an hour. It seemed like an hour, but I'm sure that I didn't have patience back then to wait that long. But I never heard it, him or her, leave, but I grew tired and eventually I just fell asleep on my bed that was next to the window. Now, there are a few things that I'm certain of. One, it was not Terry. I asked him later too, and he said that he went to bed that night when he got home. He also would have no reason to lie, so it just makes no sense for it to be Terry. I'm pretty sure that it wasn't one of our neighbors too, and I can't think of any reason that a person would be there. We had a few neighbors, and only 2 other houses out of 7 had kids. Again, too, these 7 houses were spread out in 2.5+ acres per home. There weren't any big animals in the area too, like I said, and as wooded as the whole area was, we only had some deer, but they were hunted and didn't come close to homes ever. Plus, our dog scared them away all the time, so that just doesn't make any sense. And all I can put it down to is that That night, I was out there in the woods with a stranger who apparently followed me all the way back to my own home. So I bought a Ouija board at a garage sale decades ago because I always liked the design of the board. I did try it once with a friend and a girlfriend, but nothing really happened. Very, very slight movement possibly was all really, but no messages, and so I left the board out as decoration but never really used it again. But I did try it again with just the girlfriend one time later, and it actually worked. It took a while to get going, but once it did, we were shocked at how quickly and deliberately it seemed to move, and we kept asking each other, "Are you sure you're not pushing it?" We apparently talked with more than one individual that night, including a mischievous one called 8 that showed up more than once. We would be talking with someone, then the answers would become sort of nonsensical, and we would ask, "Who is this?" and it would confess 8. After an hour, the pointer or device was moving around really fluidly, and we were both laughing and amazed and constantly accusing the other person of moving it. I know that I was barely touching it, and honestly, it looked like she was too. I'm sure that I would have felt it if she were pushing it at the speed that it was going as well. It was more like we were trying to keep up with it, I guess, but I have a sense of how the trick might work based on little jitters from tired arms, but this was moving around far too fast for that, I thought at least. What I'm getting at is that it was really weird, and I don't think that I can explain it. At one point, though, we got in touch with someone claiming to be Mary, who knew my girlfriend. My girlfriend couldn't figure it out, but then she remembered a girl back in high school by that name and asked if it was her. In response, the device went over the "we" in the Ouija board, a brand name at the top, and then my girlfriend remembered that she had known a girl named Mary from French class who had apparently died, and "we" is obviously French for yes. And that was one of those really goosebumpy moments. We asked Mary some things about where she is now and what it's like there, and then while we were thinking of what to ask next, the device started moving and spelled out, "Who's he?" Super freaky, but also made sense since I had not gone to school with them. So we said, "Oh, this is," and gave them my name, and then it spelled out "hi." But we kept asking questions and getting responses, and then at one point I made a joke, wondering how it all works. I suggested that maybe there are Ouija boards positioned around heaven, like customer service phones at the airport, and they announce it over the PA system when you have an incoming call. While my girlfriend and I are giggling at my dumb joke, the device moves very quickly over to "no," then does 2 very fast loops around the board, and on the third one flies right off the board and into the wall across the living room. Yes, this really happened, and we were both stunned and both certain that we hadn't done that, and pretty sure that the other person had. But we both insisted that we were just as surprised and scared as the other. To this day, it remains a pretty inexplicable experience. Not just the ending, but all of it too. I don't really have an explanation for the speed at which that thing moved around the board, or how it flew so far with such a short runway, with our fingers barely touching it. To this day, I'm really not sure what to make of the experience. I will say, though, that I left the board on display, but after that, I dumped the planchette and I never used it again. So I've never really told anyone about any of this because, well, I don't believe in the paranormal. I always thought that it was just rubbish, made-up stuff, and honestly, I still don't believe in it, but since this event, I still don't understand if it was real or if my mind projected something weird for a few minutes. This situation happened 4 years ago. It was January, and I was alone in my apartment in the summer, but my parents would come for a visit in a few hours. It was too hot and almost night, and I had the great idea of taking a cold shower. Since there was nobody home, I didn't close the door of the bathroom, but the shower glass door was closed all the time. And while I was taking a shower, I saw something walking in front of me outside the bathroom, and this thing went to the left and to the right 4 times. The first time I thought that it just could have been my imagination, but the second time, the figure passed through the bathroom. I turned off the shower and yelled, "Anybody here?" I thought it was my parents, but nobody answered. The figure made the same trajectory, right, left, right, left. The 4th time the figure stopped outside the bathroom, and it sort of seemed like it was looking at me for 10 to 15 seconds. Then the figure went to the left and I opened the door. I yelled again, but nobody answered. I got out of the bathroom and walked to each part of the apartment, and nobody was home. Only me. So, the wife and I live in a pretty decent area. Nicely cared for homes, trimmed yards, fairly friendly neighbours for the most part. However, we're just a couple of houses off a main street where there are a number of duplexes. We rent in a converted home from the early 1900s that's a duplex too, so no shade on that. But some of which seem to partake in, let's just say, illegal activities. Strangers parking on our street for 5 minutes to an hour, sometimes leaving someone in the vehicle, sometimes parked for days at a time. Anyway, I know the signs. There's also a fairly large homeless encampment within half a mile, so we get the occasional colourful character roaming through looking for recycling, something not nailed down, or open car doors. You get the idea, but I digress. So one Friday night around 10 p.m, there's a knock on our door. No one visits us without a heads up or an invitation, especially that late, but I thought maybe one of our neighbours needed something. Now, I'm a bit paranoid, I'll admit. Security conscious? Yeah, so I never just go and open the door. During the day, I would look out of a side window before looking through the glass at the top of the door, but due to the hour, it's dark out, so the side window isn't really an option. Also due to the hour, even if it is a neighbour, my security-minded self says that this is all wrong, so I grab my handy-dandy, I'll let your imagination fill in the blank here. I walk over to the door and flip on the porch light. I have to stand on my tiptoes to see out the little block windows at the top of the door. And there's a guy there staring at me, about my height, 6 foot, scruffy facial hair, shaved head, looking a little ticked off and maybe a bit speedy as well. The stranger says I'm looking for, and sort of garbles. I say, "Sorry, who?" He says, "Kevin." "There's no Kevin here, man," I say. "He said that he'd be here, though." "He should be here," the guy says. "You got the wrong address, or you got fished, man. Can I use your phone?" No, sorry. Good luck." I just stared at him until he turned around and walked down the steps. Then I turned off the porch light and went over to the blinds to watch him wander down the street. I don't know if the guy was legitimately lost or looking for some fool to just open their door, but I don't take chances. Even during the day, unless I ordered something that I know I need to sign for and you can't properly identify yourself, you can leave it on the porch and I'll get to it when I get to it. The door stays closed. Trying to kick it in, good luck, because I've bolted that sucker and the odds will not be in your favor. Again though, I don't know if the guy was legitimately lost or if he was just looking for somebody to open their door to do who knows what. Something tells me though that he wasn't lost. So when I was a kid, I was walking through the woods with a friend one day. Keep in mind too that this was before everyone had cell phones. We were looking for good wood to build a hut or something, I think, but after looking around, we spotted a white rope around a tree. As kids, we were scared and sort of slowly approached the tree because we didn't know what it was. And then we spotted a leg with no pants on. We sort of edged our way around the tree and we could see a fully undressed man with a sack over his head, and he didn't seem to move. At that, we ran to a busy bike path 200 meters further, running and asking people to stop and listen. One older guy wanted to help, but his wife was like, "No, it's a joke," and they walked away. So, both still scared for this guy, as maybe he needed help or something, we went back. And yeah, he was just still sitting there. We approached slowly. He hasn't seen us because we approached from the back. When all of a sudden, he moves. In fact, he just stood up, removed the ropes, and we stayed hidden and looked on in silence. The man removed the mask, dropped it on the ground, and walked away to another part. Bear in mind, he's totally naked, walking like nothing happened. We followed him for some distance. He never looked around or said anything. We also kept silent too, because if we had said anything, we would have been spotted. When we reached the path, a random woman came on her bike and started talking to him. I guess that she knew him because she greeted him and asked about his walk or something. My friend then stood on something and made some noise. I think a branch snapped. They looked up at us, so at that, we ran away. I don't know what was going on there that day, but it was a really strange circumstance and something that's always stuck with me. So, for a couple of weeks now, I've been seeing humanoid figures in my room, like standing on the edge of my bed or beside it or behind items. They look like shadows and they just stand there, sometimes sort of swaying. I've had some mental health issues lately and I realized that they could be hallucinations, but the hallucinations that I've had are very different to this. For ages, I've been waking up between 1 or 3 a.m. for some reason, and just recently I've started seeing these shadow people. One particular one that stands out is this weird thing, really. It had hollowed out eyes that were almost pitch black. It had long fingers that were like 4 inches long. I use metric, so I'm not exactly sure, but its skin was pale and it had a hat on its head. In fact, I'm not sure if it was a hat, I guess, but the hat was like 2 long cones that were black and white striped across of it. It peeked out from behind a box in my room, then went back behind it. When I shined my flashlight on my phone towards it, there was nothing. Now, I would just chalk all of this up to hallucinations, but I've had other weird things happen too, like my blanket being pulled or tugged on, or a feeling like something is on it or holding it down. These are very physical experiences too, and I really don't know what to make of them. Does anyone know what to do about any of this and what precautions I should take? I'm losing a lot of sleep over this too, and I would like a fast solution if that's possible, because, man, I'm absolutely exhausted. So, for context, I'm an 18-year-old female who used to work at a 24-hour subway. I worked there for almost 2 years until I quit this past July. For over a year, I was one of the store openers and would get there around 7 in the morning to start tasks. Keep in mind, I would usually be alone until around maybe 9 or 10 when another co-worker's shift would start. And even though I only have a few scary stories from my 2 years of working there, which all in all is pretty good considering how long I was there for, I and some of my old co-workers still believe that it was haunted. So one morning when I was alone, I was standing in the back when I heard from the front a woman's voice saying hello 3 times. It was almost like a loud whisper, I would say, and of course my first instinct is that the bell that we have on the door didn't work and a customer is out there waiting. Except when I walked out to the front, there was no one there. Not even a car outside of the store. The song on the radio was a familiar song from the 90s, sang by a male artist, so there was no way that it could have been that. And why would an artist put background vocals of a creepy whisper in a song anyways? In fact, I remember hearing the first hello and turning my head and listening more carefully as it said hello 2 more times, so I know for a fact that I didn't imagine it. After this instance, I had another, a while later, where I was in the back and heard one of our bread cabinet doors slam shut out front. This is a very distinct noise for anyone who has worked in a subway because we are constantly getting bread and closing the cabinets. Immediately after I heard it shut, I ran out the back to, again, see nothing. No customers, no cars out front, nothing. We also don't like to keep bread cabinets open since air could get in and make the bread stale, so I know for a fact that I didn't leave it open for the wind to shut it. My last story happened more than once on different occasions, and I would like to think that this was the spirit messing with me and wanting me to think that I was crazy. Again, I would be in the back alone when I would hear what sounded like somebody sweeping the floor in the front towards the cash register. It was a sort of swooshing noise that would happen over and over again for at least 3 seconds at a time. The thing is that I would move slightly and it would start, and when I stopped moving, it took another second for it to stop, so I knew that it wasn't me making the noise. For example, I would take a step and there would be a swoosh. I would stop and it would swoosh again, and then it would stop. It would happen sometimes 5 times in a row until I would walk to the front that is like 3 feet away and see nothing again. Also, it would only ever happen when I was alone and would start to happen when I was just sitting or standing around on my phone in the back. I feel like the spirit, or whatever it was, wanted me to think that I was the one making the swoosh noise, while also making me feel creeped out at what I was hearing. Also, whenever I heard the swooshing noise, I pictured a woman with blonde hair in a white dress, which I don't know why, but it just popped up in my head when I heard it. At the time of these things last year, I was in a bad mental place and exhausted from always being out of the house at school, work, or competitive dance, which is why I feel like the spirit only really showed itself to me because, I don't know, I think I was a bit low and didn't have many friends at school and all that. Even though those are my only experiences, I still feel as though there was a woman's spirit roaming around somewhere in that subway, as crazy as that sounds. A few years ago, I was working at a pizza chain in my hometown as a driver. I was 27, but made some pretty good money delivering, let me tell you. I had worked at a few other places, both local and chain in the years before, and still work as a dasher on occasion, even after this happened. But now I choose to deliver in much safer areas for this reason. I got luckier than I could have ever imagined. So one night, I was working and had a double, 2 deliveries to take. Both were cash orders. I had $12 left in my bank, what drivers are given to use as change for cash orders, so you don't have a ton of cash on you at all times. The first order, it went smoothly. The guy gave me $50 for a $35 order, so I was excited about the nice tip. I drove to the second delivery. It was at an apartment complex with multiple buildings. I had delivered there before. The sun was about to set, but it was still pretty light out. The chain that I worked at had us drive company cars with the logo on it, all white sedans, and this is important. I grab the order and I go to the door to the apartment building. A young guy comes out, and a much bigger older guy was outside smoking a cigarette. The big guy went inside as the smaller guy came out. He looked around sort of nervously and asked how much he owed me. The way he was looking around, though, just made me very nervous all of a sudden. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I told him the amount, and he said that that wasn't what he was told on the phone. Something was wrong, and it was then when I felt someone else walk out behind me from the door, as the first young guy looked around down the parking lot, craning his neck as if he was looking for someone. I told him the amount again, and broke down the order for him, trying to keep calm. And then, all of a sudden, the first guy held a gun right to my temple. I also felt a poke on my spine, because there were 2 gunmen. I couldn't speak. Words wouldn't form no matter how hard I tried. "Give me your money and your keys now," the first guy growled, and I fumbled immediately for the keys. I gave him everything, but hadn't realized the 50 was mixed in, and I gave him the keys, trying my best to remain calm. Another guy came up from my left. He had sort of poofy hair and was around the same age as the first kid. The one behind me I hadn't seen yet. The big hair kid grabbed the pizza bag and ran off and hid. The first kid searched the company car. Luckily, I'd left my wallet in my personal car. I saw him grab my cell phone, though, and that's when the panic began to set in. I had pictures on that phone that I hadn't backed up of my 5-year-old son, who absolutely is my world. So I said, please don't take that. I have pictures of my son who died on there. It's all I have of him, please." I lied. My son is very much alive. The kid behind me spoke softly. "Trust me, just listen to him. You'll get it back undamaged. I don't want to be here either." I could tell that he'd been crying by how his voice sounded. A car began pulling up, and the 3 boys took off to the other end of the complex in a full sprint. Before the one behind me ran, he dropped the gun in front of me. Standard issue 9mm silver and black, and safety off. Looked completely real to me. He picked it back up and ran with the others. The car that pulled in saw me. It was a woman and her kid. Panic set in as I realized that they could possibly come back and do way worse to me as the sky started to get dark. But I collapsed. They had taken my company car keys, $72, the pizza, and my phone. The woman ran up to me and asked if I was all right. She took me into her apartment in the next building over, and we locked the door. I was shaking so hard I couldn't even hold her phone to talk to the 911 operator as she set down her kid. Her boyfriend, I assumed, helped me call. I spoke to the operator and told her everything. I'm actually colorblind, and these guys were obviously wearing all black and white clothes, thank God. I had a full description of the 2 of them, though, and the poor woman who helped me was going to be late for work, but she still stayed until I was off the phone and the cops had shown up. And man, she was harsh and blunt with the operator, let me tell you, but I will never forget this woman's utter kindness to me and her boyfriends as well. The cops showed up, though, and contacted my store, and my manager brought out the spare keys for me to drive the car back to the store. After dealing with the cops, I drove back and was greeted by crying and beyond worried co-workers. All of them were terrified that I was hurt. It meant a lot to me how much they cared, but I told them that I was alright. I filed the proper paperwork, and the 72 was written off as a loss to the store. Thank God, because I had worked other stores that made you pay back the money out of pocket if you got robbed to prevent drivers from stealing. I was told by the owner to take the rest of the night off and take care of myself. He gave me a hug, and he was, to this day, one of the best bosses I've ever had. What I didn't know, though, was I was in for a very long night. I called my best friend before I left the store from the store phone and asked where he was. We usually met up for drinks after work. He was around the corner at a bar, so I met up with him. His dad was a District 4 cop in my city at the time, the same district that this happened in. He told me that his dad had given him a heads up and he had 2 shots waiting for me to calm my nerves. After the 2 shots, we began playing pool when his dad called his phone and asked if I was with him yet. He said yeah and handed me the phone. His dad asked if I could come to the station. I was honest and told him that I'd had 2 shots, so he sent out a squad car to get me since it wasn't that far away. We get to the station and they actually had the suspects in custody, and I was needed to ID them. There were 3 boys and a driver, and they had been caught less than 20 minutes after the robbery, speeding. The BOLO had already gone out, and they matched the description. They had used the money to buy weed and gas, and they had taken off. They had at least 15 stolen cell phones on them. The order had been placed on a stolen phone, and my phone was in the mix with the box. The police told me to grab my phone only, and I did. They asked me to unlock it. It had fingerprint verification, so that was easy. 9 of the 10 tries to unlock it had already been used before my phone would have completely reset, and it unlocked. I told the police every detail yet again, although my parental instincts kicked in. I told them the guy behind me quite obviously was bullied into this and to show mercy. He was the one with the white t-shirt. The police went wide-eyed and told me that he was the one talking. The other 3 denied involvement, and that's when I found out about the 4th guy, the driver. He found out later that he was completely unaware of the robbery and was just picking up his friends. He was never charged. The boy who was behind me, though, and the one who grabbed the pizza were 15 and 16 and got 6 months of house arrest. The only reason the one behind me got off easy, despite having the gun to my back, was because I asked them to go easy on him and that he was a good kid who just didn't want to be there. He was also the only one confessing, and it makes sense since he had even said the other guy wouldn't have the phone for long. He was planning on going to the cops, had they not been caught, but the other guy, the first kid who put the gun to my temple, it was his 18th birthday, and he got the book thrown at him. In the courtroom, he actually made fun of me as well and was laughing at me. Seeing him made me panic a bit. The judge scolded him for his behavior, and he just grinned and glared at me with a Joker-like smile. All I could see was pure evil. This kid, I'm sure of it, will commit way more crimes. I have no doubt that he's eventually going to end someone's life, in fact, and you could just see how cold he was just by looking in his eyes. I grew up in a town full of murderers and abusers, and I had never seen this kind of evil in my life before. Quite honestly, too, I don't ever want to see it again. I asked to have my name stricken from the records, and I asked to remain anonymous in case he ever got out, and I'm so glad that I did that because today I got a letter from the state. He's being released in February. The court only had my old address, my parents' house, and my mum didn't think the letter was important. I missed the deadline to protest his release for probation. The plea deal was 8 years, and it's only been 4. Also, he's getting out early due to overcrowding. Not good behavior, but overcrowding. This coming February, and I'm ready if he finds me. My wife, my parents, everyone I know knows his face and name, and if he tries anything, we're all ready. And for his sake, I really hope that we don't ever meet again. So I, a 19-year-old female, was asked to sing at a naturalization ceremony in my city by my old vocal teacher. My aunt works in the building next door and came to watch and record me to watch later. I'm relatively small and have yet to meet someone who I can truly say I got bad feelings from. I wore a formal dress, not too long, not too short, and shorts underneath because the forecast said that it would be windy that day. The building was about 3 blocks from the nearest parking garage, and since it was mid-workday, all the street parking was full or cut off by construction. So, after the naturalization ceremony finished, I went with my aunt to get lunch and hang out in her office. After we finished eating, she walked me to the corner of her office and said that she would watch me walk the next few blocks and turn the corner. I never walked that area of town alone before. I was super tired and busy trying to make sure my dress didn't fly up, along with my hair and my face. I just wanted to get to my car and get home. And suddenly, this man stepped in front of me and asked where the district court was, where the naturalization took place. So I knew where that was at least, and I pointed behind me and kept walking. My aunt texted me and told me to call her once I turned the corner. I did so, and she asked who the man was. I told her that he asked where the court was, and I showed him. She told me to keep walking and let her know when I get to my car. Once I got to my car, I let her know, and she said that he followed me down the block until he looked back and saw her watching with her phone out. She said that upon seeing her, he turned off another road quickly and began walking away with something in his hand, and made sure that I was okay while being on the phone with me. I got home and I was shaking the whole time because that could have ended a lot differently. In fact, I could have not come home that day. I might not have even made it to my car, in fact.